On TV, on radio, and on your smartphone. This is Talk TV. Talk TV News at 10.
Good morning, I'm Nadira Tudor. Boris Johnson has asked Western leaders to steel themselves for a long war in Ukraine. Writing in the Sunday Times today, the Prime Minister called for additional weapons and funding, as well as more focus on getting food out of the country. This comes as Britain's top general has told every soldier to prepare to fight Russia in a potential World War III. The Sun reports new Army Commander General Sir Patrick Sanders wrote to the troops that there is now a burning imperative to forge an army capable of fighting alongside our allies and defeating Russia in battle. Former Chief of the General Staff Lord Goddard says deterring Russia with a strong army is vital, but the UK must increase its defence spending.
Russia will realise that they can't bully and they can't push over in the way that they had tried to do some 100 and odd days ago as far as Ukraine is concerned. So Patrick Sanders is right to send a battle cry, if you like, to the army, but also that's got to be heard by the government, that we've got to increase our spending on defence, and particularly our spending on our land capability.
Meanwhile, Ukraine says Russian forces are trying to push towards Kharkiv from the north. They're aiming to shell the second largest city again. The city was badly damaged in the early stage of the war when it came under heavy bombardment. It's now been hit by missile strikes as recently as Friday. And in other news, the government's warning rail strikes will punish millions of innocent people. Transport Secretary says that will include some teenagers trying to take exams. However, rail union bosses say the government wouldn't negotiate. It's the biggest industry action since 1989, with more than 40,000 staff walking out on Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. The AA has called for road charges to be dropped, but travel editor Simon Calder says it's not a good idea.
I don't think you should effectively incentivise people to drive. I think that's going to make things even worse. It's a completely different world. Of course, we've got Zoom, we've got Teams, we've got online meetings, we've got hybrid working, so you won't have anything like the same level of devastation, unless you're a frontline worker in a hospital, in a school, and you haven't got a car and you've got to get to work.
People in France are heading to the polls today for the second round of the country's elections, just weeks after April's presidential vote. French President Emmanuel Macron is in danger of falling short of a parliamentary majority after the first round of voting saw his centrist camp tied with a left-wing coalition. People around the country are marking Father's Day, including the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, who've released a picture of Prince William with his children in Jordan. Now time for today's weather.
Trust us to take you there. Times Travel sponsors Talk TV Weather.
This morning will be dry and bright for many, but we'll have a scattering of showers around, especially in the south of England and the north of Scotland. Taking a closer look at lunchtime, and in the north of Scotland we will continue to see some showers. They'll be accompanied by a blustery northerly wind. Southern Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England, however, will be much drier with some sunny spells, especially across Northern Ireland. Moving south, and Wales and the Midlands will have a better afternoon than yesterday, with some spells of sunshine around. Southern England, though, will tend to have more in the way of cloud, with risk of some showers, especially along the south coast. It will be feeling fresh for many, with temperatures certainly down compared to late. Showers may become more frequent in the southwest this afternoon. Otherwise, many will be dry.
Trust us to take you there. Times Travel sponsors Talk TV Weather.
I'm Jeremy Carl, and this is Talk TV. What makes me really angry? Injustice, lies, and people not able to say what they feel without fear of being just cast aside, cancelled, whatever you want to say.
And a very good morning to one and all this Sunday morning. It is Sunday, the 19th of June. But I'm a bit confused here on Tice Talk, because I'm not sure if it's 2022 or 1972, given what's going on in the world. It feels like we've moved back in time. rail strikes, high inflation, an energy crisis, managed decline people are talking about this great country of ours. I want your views, your thoughts on that. But I'm back after a quick break last week. A huge thanks to Daisy McAndrew for filling in. And we have a full-on, full-throated, action-packed 3 hours ahead. Yes, indeed, in the first hour, we're going to be talking about how the taxpayer, it appears, is paying £100 million in order to pay for trade union representatives to negotiate on behalf of trade union members. Up 30% in just 1 year. Is that good value for money? We're going to be talking about the European Convention of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, after the scandalous decision this week about Rwanda, and the tweets have already started coming in about that. That's the first hour. In the second hour, of course, we need to talk inflation, the crisis, how on earth we get on top of it. That is so important. We're also going to be doing something a little bit different. Oil rigs that, extract the oil from the North Sea. Maybe we could save literally tens of billions of taxpayers' cash by leaving them there when they're finished with, rather than decommissioning them and spending billions of pounds bringing them back on shore and creating a huge sustainable ecosystem. That'll be interesting. And then in the third hour, of course, we're going to be talking to one of the trade union leaders about the rail strikes. Is this just the beginning of a summer of deep discontent? We're going to be talking about Ukraine, the impact of all of that, and much, much more. We've got some amazing guests, but most of all, we've got you, the listeners, the viewers. I want your input, your thoughts on the big question of the morning. Should we leave the European Convention of Human Rights and replace it with something rather British? Yes, it's called our own British Bill of Rights. After all, we invented it. Why should we outsource it to someone else? For heaven's sake, that's my big question. Should we leave the ECHR? But secondly, my other question, should actually it be allowed for people to strike on the railways? Are they a part of our critical national infrastructure? So are they essentially like soldiers and the police who can't strike? Or are you happy that they can continue to strike and bring everyone to a complete standstill? I want your thoughts, your views. You know the number. It's 0344 499 1000. Or tweet us at Talk TV or text 87222, of course, using the word talk. And then you can watch us as well. All sorts of different ways now. There's Sky, there's Virgin, there's Freeview, there's FreeSat. There really is no excuse not to watch or listen or getting involved. Stay with us for the next 3 hours. You're listening to Tice Talk here on Talk TV. Yes, I know it's irresistible. It's Sunday morning. Whatever you're doing, that music means that it's Sunday sermon time. And yes, I was racking my brains thinking about what would be an appropriate Sunday sermon this morning. And I want you to imagine you're a bartender in a cocktail bar. Bear with me. I know it's a bit early, but just bear with. And a customer walks in, and the customer says to you, I've got bad news. In fact, I've got really, really bad news. We're facing the gravest economic crisis since the Second World War. That's what the customer says. And I say, as the bartender, you say, well, hang on, why? What's really happening? And the customer says, well, we've got 4 ingredients of this crisis. The first is, we've got a crisis of growth, a lack of growth. So we've got a growth crisis. The lowest growth forecasts for 70 years. The second crisis, at the same time, is we've got a tax crisis. We've got the highest taxes also for about 70 years. And then we've got another crisis, an inflation crisis, the highest inflation for 30 years plus. Anybody under the age of 40 has never seen this before. And then finally, just to cap it off, we've got a productivity crisis. Yes, apparently, although there's a labour shortage, we've got the highest number at 5.3 million people on out-of-work benefits of the working age population. That's 1 in 8. All those 4 things together, the customer says to the bartender, they've all come together at one moment, and that creates the gravest economic crisis since World War II. I don't think we've ever seen these four things come together. Even in the 1970s, the depths of the 70s, I don't think this combination was so serious at the same time. Still, we need to be optimistic, and so we need to say, well, you're in a cocktail bar. What cocktails have you got to try and deal with this crisis, or at least in some way provide a bit of respite, some form of joy, some form of cure? And so you're the bartender, and you've got two cocktails on the menu. The first cocktail, well, there's two. There's one that's bubbling with good news, and there's another cocktail that is laced with bad taste. It's actually pretty revolting. So let's look at them, actually. The one that's not very attractive, that's not very tasty, I'm calling the Rishi Corbyn cocktail. And the ingredients of this cocktail are as follows. A serious dose of higher personal taxes, a dash of higher corporate taxes, and then a splash of massive government spending, and then stirred with a bit of ice, but also the creation of a culture of subsidy, a culture of handouts and dependency, as though the government should do everything for you. And I think that that is a pretty unattractive, not a very tasty cocktail. And the truth is, that cocktail will not lead to respite from the problem. What it will lead towards is lower growth. What it will lead towards is ever higher inflation with ever higher energy bills. And also, if you create a sense of a complete culture of dependency, you create a disincentive to work. So I want your thoughts. Do you like the sound of that cocktail? Is that tasty? Or would you prefer the next cocktail, the good news cocktail? Because actually, there is a cure to this problem, this crisis. I think there's a delicious cocktail of ingredients out there that would provide a really tasty alternative. Now, I'm calling this cocktail, and I admit it's a bit cheesy, I'm calling it the Tasty Tice cocktail, which goes as follows. The first ingredient is that you cut taxes hard for the lowest paid by increasing personal tax threshold at which you pay any tax from 12.5 grand to £20,000. That's an extra 30 quid a week, give or take, in everybody's pocket. So that's lowering taxes. You then spice up the cocktail as follows. You cut VAT on fuel duty by 20p a litre. And then you add a few more tax cuts. And the great thing about tax cuts on consumer goods is it means lower prices. So the next thing is we get rid of VAT on energy bills. And the next thing, we get rid of these environmental levies on all our electricity bills. Those things alone save everyone hundreds and hundreds of pounds every single year. These are tasty tax cuts. And then we round off the cocktail with a bit of ice and a good splash and stirring of a VAT cut on all other goods from 20% to 18%. Now, yes, it's fair to say this cocktail, this Tasty Tice cocktail, is a bit more expensive than the Rishi Corbyn cocktail. But the result is much, much more attractive. The result is you get higher growth. We calculate by over 0.5% every single year. In the first year alone, you'd get higher inflation. Sorry, you'd get lower inflation. I've got in the Rishi Corbyn mode. You get lower inflation by about 4% in that first year. And crucially, you increase the incentive to work. So we start to get people back out of that list of out-of-work benefits back into work. And the way that you pay for this much tastier cocktail is that you cut unnecessary government spending. In the same way as we're all looking to save a few quid in our household budgets, many people are saying I need to save 5 quid in every 100. Well, if the government did the same, and I'll be talking about it shortly after the break, then the government could save, if they did 5%, that's over 50 billion a year. So the cost of my cocktail, the annual cost, at about 74 billion, most of that can be paid by government spending savings. That's the opportunity. That's the tasty cocktail that I believe lies ahead. And I want your thoughts. What sort of cocktail would you want the bartender to make for you? Do you want the tasty Tice cocktail? Or do you want the Rishi Corbyn cocktail of gloom? I know which one I want. I'm pretty certain I know which one would be much more successful in dealing with the problems that we face today, which were the same problems we faced 50 years ago in the 1970s. And we'll be talking about that throughout the show. But I want your thoughts, your views, as ever. But to summarise, you've got 2 cocktails. You've got the Rishi Corbyn cocktail, or you've got the tasty Tice cocktail of tax cuts, lower prices, higher growth, lower inflation. And with that, here endeth my Sunday sermon. Well, there we are. That's my Sunday sermon this morning. And, of course, yes, compliance have just screeched into the studio in their high-vis jacket and said, of course, drink responsibly in any cocktail bar. But there we are. We've got lots coming up. After the break, we're going to be talking to John Ventry from the Taxpayers Alliance about this extraordinary amount of our cash, 100 million quid, that we're essentially paying for union representatives to negotiate on behalf of union members. Is that really a sensible way to use our cash? It's great being a member of a union if you want to be, but if you need someone to negotiate on your behalf, maybe you should pay the fee. Why should the taxpayer pay the fee? And then later on in this hour, we're going to be talking to Professor Andrew Tenterborn about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, because I think human rights started in the United Kingdom, and I think we should have confidence about that. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk TV. and welcome back to Tice Talk. And my goodness, I think the Twitter is going to explode at what's just come in. It's unbelievable. I have to say, I'm laughing. Absolutely. Lots of people want the Tasty Tice cocktail all day. One other says, I think a Molotov cocktail would do the trick. Maybe not, but there we are. One other says, now this is interesting. Nick from Nottingham, he says, Richard, I bet you won't read this out. Well, Nick, you've challenged me and I'm going to read it out. The best solution to this unpleasant crisis, this unpleasant cocktail, is to rejoin the EU. You heard it first, folks, on Tice Talk. The good news about that is that people who voted Remain want to listen to Tice Talk. That's absolutely fantastic. Nick, I fundamentally disagree with you, but I read out your tweet. There we are, because we like to look at all opinions, all views, and we can disagree agreeably. Now, I want to get on to this first subject of the first hour, this extraordinary story that's come out today, this morning, from the Taxpayers Alliance, that the taxpayer is paying about £100 million of taxpayers' cash in order to fund about 24,000 trade union workers to do trade union activities on behalf of their members, trade union work on behalf of their members. And apparently this has been in legislation since the 1970s. And the data that the Taxpayers Alliance have just announced is that this number's gone up by about 30% in 1 year. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by the digital campaign manager for the Taxpayers Alliance, John Ventre. John, a very good morning to you. I was spluttering in my cornflakes this morning at this number. I mean, 100 million quid of taxpayers' cash in order to fund 24,000 union representatives to negotiate on behalf of union members. Is that really right?
Unfortunately, it is, Richard, and I think a lot of people will be feeling the same looking at this news this morning. I mean, it really is a staggering number, and I think when you add in sort of the context of how people are living at the moment with bills going up and everything, £100 million towards trade unions at a time when we're potentially looking at a summer of disruption really will dismay people, I think.
But this has been around, it seems, actually since the 70s. It was obviously negotiated back then. It's even in legislation, is that right?
Yes, no, that's correct. And it's only really been the last couple of years that there's been a sort of level of transparency to it, and the Cabinet Office really sort of puts out those numbers. And as you mentioned at the start there, what we found is that there's been a 31% increase in the last financial year alone. That would be from 2019 to 2020, how that's gone up to 2021. Now, of course, we're touching nearly 100 million. It's a staggering amount of money.
I mean, it really is. So this has only actually been data that's been sort of accessible in the last 4 or 5 years, is that right? Since about 2017. And this actually, the right term is used is it's paid facility time. Is that right? And what does that really mean if we drill into it?
So this is when employees of an organisation, say Transport for London, for example, when they are representatives of their union, so they'll be elected representatives of their union, are then given time from their working day to undertake union activities. So that could be, dealing with employees' concerns and those sorts of things, and telling employees about ongoing negotiations between their organisation and their union. But this can range from anywhere between 25% of their working hours to even 100%. So you will quite literally have people who spend 100% of their working hours working on behalf of unions on the taxpayers' cash.
It sort of seems an extraordinary conflict of well, it's not a conflict of interest, but it's just very bizarre that the taxpayer should pay for a negotiator to do a brilliant job negotiating on behalf of someone on the other side of the table. So essentially what I think we might be discovering is that the very well-paid Mick Lynch and his colleagues actually are we essentially sort of paying some of his salary?
Well, in essence, what we're doing is subsidising some of the strikes that we're going to see this week. I mean, I think the really galling point to take away from this is that you're going to have people, hard-working taxpayers, trying to get to work this week, and they're going to be disrupted by these strikes. All the while, unknowingly, they've been essentially paying for union activities, which then lead to things like these strikes. Yeah, it really is shocking.
And this is across the board, so it's councils, and then you've got Transport for London. And what about the NHS? What's going on in the union reps in the NHS?
Well, there are some staggering numbers from the NHS. As you said there, it really does span across the entire public sector. And, you know, what we found from our research is that, you know, trade union representatives across the NHS, they've seen, you know, some staggering numbers. I mean, there's an example from Scotland, NHS Lothian, where there are actually 40 members there of that trust who spend 100% of their time on trade union activities. And, you know, you think of where that money could go alternatively. That could go into nurses, that could go into frontline care.
Just to say that again, in one NHS trust, there are 40 people spending 100% of their time essentially on union sort of facility time.
Yes, it's hard to believe. And you imagine all of their pay, then of course, you know, they're being paid for their hours, and then that is being transposed to union activity. It's unbelievable, and I think it's really an affront to people who are facing sky-high bills, who are facing a national insurance rise, which is purportedly going towards healthcare. And I think this is one of those examples of where that money then ends up. I
mean, you know, I'd probably be less anxious if actually they were spending their time working out how, you know, how they can make the NHS and their trust, for example, work more efficiently, more productively, cut down the waiting lists, and in a sense, therefore, de-stress the activity, the work for their own members. That might be constructive and really useful. But the idea that there are 40 people in one NHS trust on full-time union duties just completely and utterly bemuses me.
Well, exactly, and, you know, a lot of the reasoning that you'll hear from the unions as to why this facility time exists is that they'll say, well, it has sort of tangible benefits in terms of making a better workplace, you know, that sort of thing, you know, communication between employees and their bosses and voicing their concerns. But, I mean, really, you know, that's nothing really that a good management structure couldn't sort out. And I think it's very hard to justify to taxpayers who are facing a 70-year high tax burden.
It's unbelievable. Joe, thank you so much for that fascinating expose. Great work there from the Taxpayers Alliance. So that's it, folks. It's approaching 10:30 and already 100 million quid's worth of taxpayers' cash in order to pay for trade union representatives to negotiate against our behalf. Brilliant. Absolutely wonderful. Well, we've got some great tweets coming in again. We've got one here. Morning, Richard. I'd go for the Tice cocktail, but you missed one thing out. SMEs are the backbone of the economy. What about a cut to NI contributions, business rates on the high street? Actually, to be honest, I think you're right. But there's just so much going on, and there was only so long for the Sunday sermon. Meanwhile, we've got another one here, a text message that's come in. Do the government want to make us poorer? Is this to do with conspiracy theories? I hope not, says Anne. Meanwhile, have we got time to go to Rudy? No, we're going to take Rudy call from Exeter after the break. But I am just reminded quite properly here by another text message. 50% of the railway service, apparently, I'm not sure it's quite 50%, will remain operational during the strike. So there should be no need to legislate that it's critical. I don't think it is 50%, but if anybody else has got information on that, let us know. We'll be talking all about that and, of course, the European Convention on Human Rights and taking your calls, 0344 499 1000. Straight after the break, it's Tice Talk here at Talk TV.
I'm Tom Newton-Dunn, and this is Talk TV. The most memorable moment in my career, without sounding completely conceited, it has to be interviewing President Trump in the Oval Office in the White House. Particularly, the little red button he had on his desk. I had no idea what it did as the interview went on. I wondered more and was this going to launch a nuclear strike on North Korea or open up a shark pit that I'd then fall into. Turned out he pressed it right at the end of the interview, and in walked a butler with a tray carrying a Diet Coke. It was the Diet Coke button.
This is Talk TV News.
Good morning, I'm Nadira Tudor. Boris Johnson has asked Western leaders to steel themselves for a long war in Ukraine. Writing in the Sunday Times today, the Prime Minister called for additional weapons and funding, as well as more focus on getting food out of the country. This comes as Britain's top general has told every soldier to prepare to fight Russia in a potential World War III. The Sun reports new Army Commander General Sir Patrick Sanders wrote to the troops that there is now a burning imperative to fortify forge an army capable of fighting alongside our allies and defeating Russia in battle. Former Chief of the General Staff, Lord Goddard, says deterring Russia with a strong army is vital, but the UK must increase its defence spending.
Frankly, to have an army of only 148 tanks and no tracked armoured fighting vehicles for the infantry to accompany them is madness. So Patrick is absolutely right that if we're going to take this seriously in the context of a long war that Boris Johnson is talking about, we've got to prepare.
Meanwhile, Ukraine says Russian forces are trying to push towards Kharkiv from the north. They're aiming to shell the second largest city again. An Interior Ministry official says Russia's trying to make it another front line. The city was badly damaged in the early stage of the war when it came under heavy bombardment. It's now been hit by missile strikes as recently as Friday. And in other news, the government's warning rail strikes will punish millions of innocent people. Transport Secretary says that will include some teenagers trying to take exams. However, rail union bosses say the government wouldn't negotiate. It's the biggest industry action since 1989, with more than 40,000 staff walking out on Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. That's all for now. We'll have more in half an hour.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk TV. It is all kicking off. We've got some right banter going on with Nick from Nottingham. Actually, I think it might be my first apology of the morning because Nick quite rightly reminded me I forgot to read out the second half of his tweet. So he's reminded me of that, and that was that most people, according to Nick, he thinks most people agree that Project Fear is now Project Fact. I don't think they do agree that at all. People I'm talking to on the doors, Nick, are not saying that at all. What a lot of people are saying is that Boris Johnson is not making advantage of the Brexit opportunity. But let's just remind ourselves what Project Fear said. They said there was going to be an immediate recession. There wasn't. They said that there would have to be an emergency budget and that hundreds of thousands of jobs would go. There wasn't. They didn't all go. They said that actually everybody would leave the country. Lots of EU citizens would leave the country. Exactly the opposite. Over 6 million EU citizens applied to stay when they thought the number was 3 million. So, Nick, actually, Project Fear was not Project Fact. Anyway, there we go. Keep them coming in. And Dan here says, let's see what this one says. Fantastic station. The next UK government should be David Bull, Mike Graham and Richard Tice. That's Dan in Aylesbury. There we go. Let's head down to Exeter, where Rudy is patiently on the line. Morning, Rudy.
Hi, Richard. I'd like to modify your cocktail with regards to reducing VAT to 18%.
Oh, OK.
So what I think they should do is, because of like these big companies like Amazon that don't pay tax in this country, they should do it so that you pay 30% VAT if you buy online and 12% if you pay in a store with bricks and mortar VAT.
Yeah, do you know, that's a really interesting... That's a variation of what I've been talking about, actually, for a number of years, Rudy, which is to basically to have no business rates on the high street for the sort of the small and medium-sized businesses, and have a small online delivery tax, which I was around about 3%. But that as a principle, I think, is quite similar to what you're suggesting. You're essentially trying to sort of level the playing field a bit.
Yeah, but with the 30% VAT, Amazon and stuff can't get away from that by having offshore companies, because they have to pay it at source, so the government will get that money. And it will also, by making the VAT so much higher, because the consumer's the one who's initially paying it, it will encourage them to go to their local store instead, which will boost the high street.
No, it's a really interesting variation, Rudy, of what I was on in terms of trying to level the playing field. I agree with you. I think it's completely wrong that the big multinationals are essentially able to, through what they call transfer pricing, they're able basically to transfer their profits into low tax or zero tax offshore havens and only pay a fraction of what they really should pay here.
And Richard, there's another thing where they could be getting loads of money and they're not doing it. Why are they not dealing with health tourism? Look at the millions of pounds they could recoup from that alone.
You're so right on that, Rudy. And again, it's a culture thing. I talked about culture in my sermon. This is a different culture thing, which is many people in the NHS think that it's sort of morally wrong to talk about money and to actually charge people who've come from overseas. I mean, many hospitals, I'm told, even barely have the ability to charge people. And actually, health tourism is a huge cost.
And that money, Richard, is what pays their wages. And then they complain they're not getting enough.
You're absolutely... ultimately, Rudy, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Somewhere, somehow, everything has to be paid for.
Go to America or go to Spain and say, I want my medical care for free, and see what you get. You get a PDQ machine pushed in front of you.
I mean, the reality is, of course, healthcare in many European countries is still free at the point of delivery, but it's just paid for in a different form of insurance system. Rudy, thank you so much for your thoughts. There's Rudy there with his thoughts about how to try and level it up between some of the high streets against Amazon. We're going to head back into London, where Pat is on the line. Hi, Pat.
Oh, good morning. Yeah, at the top of the show, you said reducing VAT to 18%.
Yes, that's right, yes.
Well, I'd go one further. I'd reduce it to 10%.
Would you? OK.
Yeah. But because what happens is that as the economy starts getting better, you can maybe up it to, say, 12%, then 15%. But I personally wouldn't allow VAT to go over 15%.
Well, of course, and those of us of a certain age remember when it was 15%.
No, but I would put it into statute, say that no government can ever put it up beyond 15%.
And obviously reducing it, there's a cost to that. But my plan is, which I talked about earlier this week, is that if you create more activity, then after about 3 years, it starts to pay for itself because you get higher growth, higher activity. But interestingly, Pat, so there's a message came in from Gary, who accuses me of being economically illiterate. I'm just trying to find it as we speak. Because, where are we? Here we are. Gary says, how does putting more money in people's pockets reduce inflation? More money changing the same goods and services pushes prices up, not down. You're economically illiterate. Gary, the point is, though, my measures reduce the price of consumer goods. So absolutely mathematically, Gary, that reduces the inflation rate, which then starts to change the culture of expectations. The other point, Gary, is that this is cost-push inflation. It's not demand-pull inflation. And most of it is driven by higher energy costs, higher food costs, which are coming from overseas, Gary. So what's actually happening is the higher energy costs, the money that we're spending, most of that money is going straight overseas. So it's not staying in our economy. So actually it's not driving up inflation if we did the measures that I said. But happy to discuss that with you further, Gary. Pat, what do you think about that?
Oh, I mean, each to his own. Everybody's got a different take on it. Would you agree?
Yeah, completely. But I just, it's important to have this discussion and to air all these thoughts.
Well, look. How much is the current income tax take? I mean, what is the percentage of income tax that the government takes on the people?
It's a lot, but I haven't got that figure exactly in front of me.
Give us a number off the top of your head, then.
Oh, well, it's what I do know is that the cost of my measure on income tax, lifting the threshold from 12.5 to about 20,000, is around about just under 40 billion off memory. That was the point. And what I'm saying is, if you create more growth, you'll get the tax revenues back in the medium term.
Why can't they cut the tax by about a penny?
Yeah, that's the other way of doing it. But what I wanted to do was put more money into the pockets of the lowest paid, because you then increase the incentive to work as opposed to being on out-of-work benefits.
Well, take them out of tax for a certain amount of time.
Essentially, that's essentially what my plan does. I take them out permanently.
For a certain amount of time, say 3 years or something.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're quite right there, Pat. That is the whole point, is that we've got to encourage an incentive to work. And remember, Pat, income tax, when it was first introduced about 300 years ago, to pay for a war.
For an army,
it was paid for war. But also, Pat, it was a tax on the rich. And now income tax is actually, it's become a tax on the poor. And that really is the thing. Pat, thank you so much for your thoughts. We've got more calls coming in that we will get to later on. Meanwhile, let's just see what we've got here. We've got one tweet that's come in. I recall this union matter was brought up in Parliament by a group of MPs around 2000, but it was squashed by Labour. Interesting point. If anyone else has got a view on that. There we go. Lots of others. One here's a bit punchy. Mick Lynch is an economic traitor. He might think that it's good to be in the 70s, but he's forgotten one thing that's different. Technology. Goes on to say, cancel HS2 and put the billions into national automation strategy. So there we are. That would save 100 billion in a heartbeat. Chris could well be right. Coming up, we're going to be talking about the ECHR, which is absolutely vital to move out of that. You're with us. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk TV. Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk TV. We are well in through the first hour of the show. The tweets are pouring in, absolutely pouring in. I'll try and get through some as quickly as I can. One here before I go to the next guest. Richard, we can't dictate who can and cannot strike unless there was an agreement upon signing up for a job in the first place. If we remove people's ability to strike, then we must simply rely on the government or private sector charity for an increase in wages. What I was really trying to say, and there's, without question, it's right that, you know, there should be unions who can negotiate on behalf of workers, but in certain areas, critical areas of our national infrastructure, it's not right that people could strike and cause, and essentially hold the nation to ransom. And the way you deal with that and have that wages is you have an independent panel, an arbitration panel, that can essentially rule on where there's a dispute for that. But, you know, it is a key talking point. Now, thinking about talking points, we've absolutely got to talk about what happened this week with the European Court of Human Rights, which, of course, is part of the it's the court that rules on the European Convention on Human Rights. And just to clarify, of course, whilst that's not part of the European Union, in truth, the whole process of Brexit was about taking back control from overseas bodies, unelected bodies, such as the ECHR, and bring it back here to the UK. And therefore, to me, actually, to continue to complete Brexit, I feel that we should be withdrawing from the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, I know that upsets a lot of people, but let's hear the view of my next guest, who's Professor Andrew Tenterborn, who wrote a very interesting piece in the Daily Mail yesterday. Andrew, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining me on Tice Talk. So, it was quite a week, wasn't it, with what went on? We had the great British legal system do its finest, went through 1, 2, I think 3 levels of our system, and we thought that was it. We thought our Supreme Court had ruled and the flight would take off. But why should the ECHR consider that they've got the right to overrule that?
Well, you're absolutely right. What this actually was the ECHR going further than it normally does. Because the way the I fully agree, obviously, that we must leave the ECHR's jurisdiction. But normally what the ECHR does is judge ex post facto. It says, you know, what the British government did a few months, a year or so ago was contrary to human rights. So it comes in with an ex post facto judgment. What it did this week was to muscle in effectively on the English legal system, because the claimant in this case seeks orders from the English court saying, stop the flight. The English court say, no, we're not going to do it. So the claimant then goes to the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Court of Human Rights says, no, freeze everything, stop everything now.
And can you just clarify that, Andrew? Because just whilst we've been speaking, I've had a tweet in from Phil who says, we ignore the ECHR allowing prisoners to vote. Our levels of compliance with the ECHR are up with the best. Time to start ignoring them again. Can you clarify this point? Because it's easy to think that this is a binding ruling, but actually many saying that actually it's only advisory.
That's a very good point. It's an open point, actually, as a matter of human rights law. Sorry to bore your viewers on this, like a professor. Richard Eakins of the Judicial Power Project certainly takes the view that these are merely recommendations. So it's a plausible view. And the way forward on this particular event, I suspect, is for Priti Patel to say, right, the next flight goes ahead, assuming the English courts don't stop it. And even if somebody rings up some unnamed duty judge at the European Court of Human Rights, very sorry, but we are going to ignore such an order. Which is arguably lawful, it's arguably unlawful, but I think it's a fairly technical matter.
But it really is key, isn't it? If it's, I read that some other countries, they only essentially abide by about 50% of the relevant rulings for their country by the ECHR, and yet we seem to be the most compliant. And you sort of then wonder, well, actually, you know, is our government being a bit soft on this? But I guess, you know, my other question is, what right have they got in the first place to overrule our Supreme Court?
On the question of the flight to Rwanda, it's one of their rules of court that just says the court may make a recommendation telling a government to stop doing something. More generally, they have no right to overrule our courts. The European Convention on Human Rights is a treaty. It's binding in international law, and it's binding in international law. If we disobey its rulings, we are guilty of a breach of international law. But that is it, and that, of course, is how the European Convention on Human Rights is sold. It is the European Court of Human Rights is not an English court, although the convention itself is part of English law. I don't know if that answers your question.
It sort of does, but my next question is that it appears from what we've... we don't know who the judge was, which doesn't seem very transparent, but also the UK government didn't have the right to defend itself. Is that really right?
Well, that is really the point I'm making. You and the news media know perfectly well there's a thing called an interlocutory injunction. When you get a phone call from an English judge saying, I have just signed this order between the soup and the fish on my dining table, saying stop the publication because it might be defamatory or it might be libelous. He's not deciding whether it is or it isn't. He's just saying, well, it might be, and we'll keep things frozen for the moment. That was the nature of the European Court's order this time. It's not saying this flight is contrary to the European Convention on Human Rights. It's saying it might be, and can you please stop it until we have sorted it out? Now, that involves essentially the European Court of Human Rights saying we have the right to dictate to governments how they're to carry out a policy agreed in an election until we have okayed that policy. That seems to me to be unacceptable.
I think that's absolutely the position. But let's look at it from the other side of the argument. There are many people who are saying, well, no, hang on, we were a founding father of the European Convention, and that the only people who've left it are Russia and I think it's Belarus, and that, you know, we should continue to lead the way. What do you say to that line of argument on the other side, Andrew?
Oh, very simple. Murmur to such people the names of such countries as Australia, New Zealand and Canada, none of which is a member of any regional human rights convention. None of them, as far as I know, is a hotbed of fascism. You could then, of course, also mention such well-known beacons of freedom as Azerbaijan, which is, of course, a member of the European Convention on Human Rights. So, you know, getting out of the convention doesn't mean you become a hotbed of fascism. There is another technical point, which is that the European Convention on Human Rights has been transformed out of all recognition since we signed it in 1950. I think it's 1950.
This is the key point, isn't it? It's 70 years old, isn't it?
Yes, and since about 1990 or 1995, we have had a very activist human rights judiciary, members of the European Court of Human Rights, who have been extending almost beyond recognition the original rights laid down in the convention. Now, I think we have every moral right at that point to say, well, wait a moment, we have a right to give 6 months' notice to get out. This is nothing like the convention that we originally signed up to. We want to go. Now, I'd be quite happy, actually, if we did introduce some British Bill of Rights, a homegrown constitutional document. But I am very unhappy with the idea of a European-grown constitutional document, which this is becoming.
And that's the point, isn't it? You know, I mean, we're one of the leading nations in the world. We virtually invented human rights. Individual rights we started back in, whatever it is, about 1,000 years ago with Magna Carta. Why should we need other people to tell us about human rights? I'm with you, Andrew. I think that we should have a British bill. I mean, that's what supposedly Dominic Raab was talking about. Have we got any idea when he's going to actually table this British Bill of Rights?
Oh, yes, we do. I can give you a sneak preview. It's coming out, my spies tell me it's coming out on Tuesday.
Oh, well, let's hope. And then we can see. But then the question is how long it'll take him to get it through the Houses of Parliament. What's your prediction?
It'll take a very long time because where it's going to meet serious opposition is the House of Lords. Because if ever there was a sort of retirement home for those who rather like the existing comfortable settlement with the metropolitan elite. It is the House of Lords. And you will have every backwoodsman and backwoodswoman getting up and saying this is going to make us a pariah, etc. Well, we are trying to cut down the effect of the Human Rights Act, and so on and so on.
Indeed, Andrew. Well, they've got an 80-seat majority. They need to use it with determination and a robust focus. Andrew Tentenbaugh, thank you so much for your thoughts there on leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. Coming up after the news, we'll be talking to Julian Jessup about inflation and economics. And I'll ask him about the question that I'm debating. And Gary Mitchell on Twitter, we've got quite a fundamental disagreement about economics and supply side and what causes inflation. So I'll be challenging Julian on exactly that, because Gary thinks that my proposals would actually increase inflation. I don't think it would. I think it would cut inflation, it cuts prices, and so much of our money is going outside of the economy through energy prices. We'll keep at it. You're listening to Tice Talk. It's the home of common sense. It is, of course, Talk TV.
On TV, on radio, and on your smartphone. This is Talk TV. Talk TV News at 11.
Good morning, I'm Nadira Tudor. Boris Johnson has asked Western leaders to steel themselves for a long war in Ukraine. Writing in the Sunday Times today, the Prime Minister called for additional weapons and funding, as well as more focus on getting food out of the country. This comes as Britain's top general has told every soldier to prepare to fight Russia in a potential World War III. The Sun reports new army commander General Sir Patrick Sanders wrote to the troops that there's now a burning imperative to forge an army capable of fighting alongside our allies and defeating Russia in battle. Former Chief of the General Staff, Lord Goddard, has told Times Radio deterring Russia with a strong army is vital, but the UK must increase its defence spending.
Russia will realise that they can't bully and they can't push over in the way that they had tried to do some 100 and odd days ago as far as Ukraine is concerned. So Patrick Sanders is right to send a battle cry, if you like, to the army, but also that's got to be heard by the government, that we've got to increase our spending on defence, and particularly our spending on our land capability.
Meanwhile, fierce fighting continues in the east. Ukraine says Russian forces are trying to push towards Kharkiv from the north, and the situation is difficult. They're aiming to shell the second largest city again. Kharkiv was badly damaged in the early stage of the war when it came under heavy bombardment, but has been hit by missile strikes as recently as Friday. And in other news, the government's warning rail strikes will punish millions of innocent people. Transport Secretary says that will include some teenagers trying to take exams. However, rail union bosses say the government wouldn't negotiate. It's the biggest industry action since 1989, with more than 40,000 staff walking out on Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. The AA has called for road charges to be dropped, but travel editor Simon Calder says it's not a good idea. Police in Brazil have confirmed that British journalist Dom Phillips was shot to death by hunting ammunition. This comes 4 days after his body was recovered and 2 weeks since he went missing alongside Bruno Pereira. 3 people have been arrested in connection with the murders. Dame Kelly Holmes says she's finally free after coming out. The sporting legend spoke to the Sunday Mirror during Pride Month, saying she's been living a secret life for decades. She was scared of being outed after winning her Olympic medals in Athens in 2004, and that she'd be punished for being gay in the army when it was illegal. People around the country are marking Father's Day, including the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, who've released a picture of Prince William with his children in Jordan. The photo was taken in autumn last year. Now time for today's weather.
Trust us to take you there. Times Travel sponsors Talk TV weather.
This morning will be dry and bright for many, but we'll have a scattering of showers around, especially in the south of England and the north of Scotland. Taking a closer look at lunchtime, and in the north of Scotland we will continue to see some showers. They'll be accompanied by a blustery northerly wind. Southern Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England, however, will be much drier with some sunny spells, especially across Northern Ireland. Moving south, and Wales and the Midlands will have a better afternoon than yesterday, with some spells of sunshine around. Southern England, though, will tend to have more in the way of cloud, with risk of some showers, especially along the south coast. It will be feeling fresh for many, with temperatures certainly down compared to late. Showers may become more frequent in the southwest this afternoon. Otherwise, many will be dry.
Trust us to take you there. Times Travel sponsors Talk TV weather.
I'm Jeremy Carl, and this is Talk TV. What makes me really angry? Injustice, lies, and people not able to say what they feel without fear of being just cast aside, cancelled, whatever you want to say.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here this Sunday morning. We are well into now the second hour of my show. I don't know where the first hour has gone, but what I do know is we are deluged, absolutely deluged with tweets. I don't think in the last 9 months or so of doing the show I've ever had quite so many, so I'm not going to be able to get through them all. But an interesting one from Victoria, following on from that discussion earlier. I live in a rural area and rely on eBay and Amazon for things I can't get locally. Many small companies trade through them. and you want to tax them more. Typical clueless London-centric. I think the point is, Victoria, what I'm trying to do is to make it easier for small towns and for the high street to be able to compete against the likes of Amazon. And high street shops pay very high business rates, and therefore that often means they can't afford to offer the lower prices that Amazon pays, because Amazon pays much lower business rates because it operates from warehouses around the back of towns and things. That was the point. But I take the point. No one's saying that Amazon and eBay isn't a good service. It's just about trying to provide some form of fair competition. Anyway, I'm delighted that my next guest is an expert in understanding things about free markets, economics, competition. Julian Jessup is an independent economist and fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And Julian, a very good morning. Thanks for being with us on Tice Talk. So, unfortunately, we need to keep talking about inflation because it is going continually and rapidly in the wrong direction, isn't it? I mean, I think when we last spoke, we were talking about sort of 7-8%. Here we are just a matter of weeks later, and the people are talking about 11% heading north, not south. Where, Julian, where does this stop? What triggers something to change in your view?
Well, at the moment, actually, I'm probably more optimistic than most people on the outlook for inflation. But of course, frankly, that's not difficult considering how bad the outlook appears to be. I personally think inflation is probably already quite close to the peak. That's partly for bad reasons. The economy is slowing, so the sort of demand side pressures on inflation are easing. I also think some of the supply chain problems are going to fix themselves. We've had these problems of one type or another for quite a long time now. So there's an enormous incentive for companies and for customers to adjust and to find ways around these problems. And also central banks are finally waking up to the problem. So they're starting to raise interest rates and to slow the growth of the money supply. So I think there are some good reasons to expect inflation to peak perhaps a bit sooner and at a lower level than people are fearing. It's still going to be very, very high, so there's not much consolation in the meantime.
No, and of course inflation is sort of split into two elements. You've got inflation caused by an excess of demand, haven't you, what they call demand pull, but you've then got inflation caused by essentially a shortage of supply, and so the price goes up. And it's more of the latter that we've had with the cost of energy, haven't we? Sort of cost push inflation.
That's true, but two arguments pushing back against that. One is that energy prices do appear to have levelled out. So even if prices remain at this current high level, as long as they don't rise further, then that means that the impact on inflation should start to fade. The second point is that, yes, I know that we obviously focus most on the prices that are increasing at the fastest rate. But the reality is that because there's so much free or cheap money sloshing around chasing too few goods and services, we would have high inflation somewhere. If it wasn't in food and energy prices, it might well just be in something else. And I think it's important not to forget that big picture. If it wasn't pure food, it would be something else going up instead.
So that's the balance of judgment that the Bank of England, as our central bank, has to make at what rate they increase interest rates, essentially taking that into account without causing a over steep fall into an ever deeper recession.
Well, that's right. I've actually got a lot of sympathy for the Bank of England here. I've been critical of the decisions that they've made, but these are pretty much unprecedented times, and it is very difficult to make these calls. I still think, though, they've made the wrong one. The question here is, what is the bigger risk? Is it, leaving interest rates too low for too long, maybe supporting the economy in the short term, but meaning that inflation is a lot higher than it needs to be? Or is it raising rates a bit more aggressively now, possibly dampening growth a little bit, but sending a clear signal to the markets and to decision makers, including wage and price setters, that the bank is serious about getting inflation down? And I think that would have been the right thing to do. I think it would have been right to raise interest rates more quickly, as some other central banks have done, and also to have ended the policy of money printing a lot sooner than the Bank of England has done.
So where do you see interest rates going? Where do you see the peak of interest rates from here? They're now at 1.25%.
Well, I expect interest rates to rise to at least 2%, maybe 2.5% by the end of this year, and then 3% next year. Now, I know that will worry a lot of people, and undoubtedly that's a lot of pain for people with mortgages in particular. But I think from the point of view of the economy as a whole, it's actually quite a healthy thing. I mean, one of the reasons we're in this mess in the first place is that interest rates have been too low for too long. And even 3% interest rates compared to where inflation is likely to be is still a historically pretty low level. And I don't think that alone would be enough to tip the economy into recession.
Indeed, but so what I've been talking about this week is that actually, see, at the moment, the Chancellor's solution to this, he's raising taxes on one hand, but then he's creating a culture of dependency by giving handouts. My proposal is different. I'm saying we should be cutting taxes for consumer goods, cut VAT by a couple of %, cut the taxes on fuel duty, on VAT on energy, cut the environmental levels. If you do that, by reducing prices on consumer goods, you reduce inflation. And if you actually lift the personal tax threshold from 12.5 grand to 20 grand, then actually, for the lowest paid, the least well off, you're doing the other thing, which is increasing the incentive to work as opposed to being on out-of-work benefits.
Well, I think there's a lot in that. I mean, as it happens, I do all of those. I think if you want to get money to the most vulnerable households quickly, then those sorts of cash payments are the best way to do it, however uncomfortable one may feel about that. But you do need to do other things as well. And I think you're absolutely right that, tax cuts can actually help here with inflation rather than fuel it. They can help.
So this is a key point, actually, because there's someone on Twitter who I think probably is pretty financially clued up, called Gary, who says that Tice doesn't understand economics because if we do my proposal, then that would increase inflation because you're putting more money into the system. And essentially the supply of the commodities and goods is constrained and that's driving the prices. So just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, that's very much the government's line at the moment. We're hearing that a lot from Treasury ministers and even from the Prime Minister himself. There's a small element of truth in that. If you pump more money into the economy, then inflation's likely to be higher. But interestingly, the Bank of England itself did a bit of analysis of the government's recent cost of living support package, and it reckoned that would add precisely 0.1% to inflation. In other words, right. next to nothing. So I think that the risks on the upside are pretty small, but there are also ways that it can help. So, tax cuts can directly help people to deal with inflation, but they can also lower inflation, both directly and indirectly.
That's the point. Sure, there's a one-off reduction in inflation because you reduce the price of things. But here's my other point.
Exactly.
My other point is that lots of the money, the increase in prices on energy and food, when we buy those goods, that money actually is going out of our economy forever because it's going to the energy producers, the oil and gas producers overseas.
That's partly true, though, of course, we get some of that back in tax revenues and so on, particularly with the additional windfall tax. But I think the key point perhaps now is that the price pressures have spread well beyond just fuel and food anyway. So there's a broader problem here. So I think it does need the government to pull all of the levers. I think it's absolutely right to make those cost of living payments, but I think it does need to be topped up by other measures in the short term, so tax cuts, reducing levies and so on, but also supply side measures to tackle the underlying problems that are keeping inflation high. So whether that's the cost of childcare or the cost of housing, and of course a fundamental review of the energy market itself, because policy there has actually contributed to the mess that we're currently in.
Completely. I mean, it's utterly failed, in my view, a decade of failed energy policies by essentially successive Conservative governments. I mean, I'm a great fan of using the shale gas treasure under our feet. I mean, there's over £1 trillion worth in the rocks. I reckon that's the best form of levelling up. You can have £1 trillion worth of levelling up by drilling down.
That's a nice idea. I mean, I'm not really an expert on the fracking idea, but it does seem odd to me that we're simply excluding a possible source of energy that has been very successful in keeping prices down in the US in particular over the last 5 to 10 years. So it does seem odd that we're ruling out that option completely.
It really does. Julian, thank you so much for your thoughts there. Julian Jessup, the independent economist, an absolute guru on all matters of inflation. He thinks I'm partly right. Gary's partly right on this big debate. What are your thoughts? What are your views? 0344 499 1000. And I think I've just got time for a call from Slough, where Rita is there. Morning, Rita.
Morning, Richard. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. Loving the show.
Yeah, we've just got just over a minute, Rita. What's on your mind?
Well, I just want to say, if you want to cut income tax, how will you pay for public services then?
Because what you do is you cut some of the wasteful government spending, of which there is masses. We see it all around the place. All of us are looking to essentially sort of cut a little bit off our household budgets. And what I'm saying to the government, Rita, is, across all the departments, cut some of the unnecessary spending. I mean, the idea that, just a small example, Rita, the Bank of England governor spent £200,000, unbelievably, on a mission statement. I mean, if he's not good enough to create his own mission statement, he shouldn't be good enough to do the job.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's right. Also, will your party be standing in Slough as well when the general election comes?
Yeah, I've just lost you. We've got not a very great line there, Rita. I've just lost that. But I think you were saying you'd seen lots of waste in Slough. That was Rita with her thoughts, her questions. Yeah, I mean, the government needs to reduce wasteful spending. We all see it all over the place. And if you see it in your area, give us a call. Let us know of that example. But we've got £100 million being spent on trade union reps. I'm not really sure that the taxpayer should be paying that. I've given you the example of the Bank of England. It's all over the place. And we can accommodate some additional short-term borrowing to create higher growth over the medium term. That will generate higher wages. That will generate, therefore, higher tax revenues in the medium term. It's not a coincidence. Countries that have lower tax rates overall have higher growth rates. That is the key point. Meanwhile, good to welcome new listeners, new viewers. Kev here has just said, good show, Richard. I like your programme. First time of watching. Thanks for messaging that in, Kev. Stay with us. We've got lots coming up. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk TV. Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk TV. We're into the second hour of my show. My wonderful production team have just made quite an interesting suggestion. Judging by the number of calls and tweets following the Sunday sermon, which was sort of cocktail-based, Dave has just suggested that maybe we should make the Sunday sermon more sort of Tice's tipple. Anyway, what are your thoughts on that? Meanwhile, another Dave has messaged in, Mr. Tice, your attitude against working class people asking for pay rises and having to strike because their employer won't give them one, saying that their right to strike should be stopped, stinks of conservative Thatcherite, and shows that you're not to be trusted. The point I'm making, Dave, is I'm not saying there shouldn't be a right to strike for many people, but it's a question of on critical industries, and so the debate is, are the railways one of those critical industries? Is it part of our critical national infrastructure? And is it right, Dave, that they can just go straight to striking, like effectively for a whole week, before, for example, you know, they're not properly sat down. They haven't told us what they're really striking about. There's just sort of generic things. That's my point. And I would say that actually, given my tax proposal is to cut taxes hard for the lowest paid, the least well off, I would say actually exactly the opposite. I'm supporting those on low pay, low incomes by taking them out of taxes. I just think that there needs to be a fair balance about one particular union holding literally the nation to ransom. Is that fair? Is that reasonable? Or would a more reasonable approach to looking at pay rises in such an industry as the railways to say, let's have an independent arbitration mechanism as opposed to striking? But thanks for your thoughts there, Dave's. We've got from, I think it's Dover, we've got Clive on the line. Morning, Clive.
Good morning, Richard, and thank you very much for taking my call.
Great pleasure. What's on your mind?
Yes, I just want to comment about our train drivers. It fascinates me that the fact that the semi-skilled train drivers are earning more than airline pilots, working for half the hours. They got gold-studded pensions, double time for working Sundays, fully paid for high levels of sickness. And I have to talk about this over the last 50 years. The reason why we don't make cars, and we only have a small number of docks, hardly any shipbuilding. We're an island, yet most of our goods come from Europe, all because of union restrictive practices and resistance to change and modernise. This is typical of what happened all those years ago.
No, there's no question. Of course, it was back in sort of the 60s and 70s, wasn't it, Clive? I mean, I was born in 64, but, you know, overly militant unions made it impossible for British industry in many different areas to function properly, and that led to businesses shutting down and going overseas.
Richard, I was in a shipyard at Harland and Wolff in the late 70s. I'm a marine engineer. I was standing by having 4 ships built. It took up to 10 people to drill one hole in a bulkhead. Now, I've got all this background in my mind all the time, and I can fully understand how we got here again with these bloody dinosaurs. It's just like history repeated itself all over again.
It really is, which is why I introduced my whole show by saying, are we in 2022 or 1972? It is unbelievable. I mean, look,
that's what kicked me off.
and I guess, look, you know, the whole point of unions is to protect their members in terms of conditions, but I think it's where the demands are unreasonable. And I'm hopefully talking to someone from the RMT a bit later, and I just want to clarify some of the points there. I don't think we'd mind if they said, look, you know, we want higher bonuses for better productivity, better quality of working, making the trains run more punctually, more on time. Then I think there's a proper grown-up debate to be had.
But Sunday, for instance, is a normal day now. And the fact that they get paid overtime for working, well, they're already on 60k, and the fact they get overtime for working Sunday is just ridiculous.
Yeah, I think I've got real concerns about it. Someone told me, and I want to ask whether this is true or not, they even get a sort of a walking time allowance.
Yes, they do. I've read that.
From their mess room to the train. This just seems like out of the ark, not in the 2020s.
Richard, would it be cheeky if I had made one point about immigration?
Go for it before I go down to Bournemouth.
Thank you. Well, I think personally all illegal young men should be housed in an army-style dormitory-type accommodation, which would include, of course, medical, food, gym, security, TV, games, all that sort of stuff. We would look after them. Of course, it was charter, folks. And what happened, Richard? They tried to burn it down. In fact, they did burn 2 buildings down.
Well, there was another one where actually
Napier Barracks at Folkestone, that was.
That's right, and I think they actually claimed that it wasn't good enough for them.
No, exactly. But
there's a slightly Dave, Clive, you're like this. There's a slightly cheeky message that's come in. Instead of decommissioning the oil rigs, maybe we should turn them into offshore migrant centres. Yeah. I think it probably was said tongue-in-cheek, but ultimately, these are all sort of, we've got a massive problem, and, the government has come up with a solution because nothing else seems to be working. Clive, thank you so much for your thoughts there. We're going to head on down to Bournemouth, where Karen is, I think, on the line. Good morning, Karen.
Good morning. I would just like to say that it seems to me that it's going to be a never-ending problem because as the taxpayer, we are paying the government to sort out immigration, and as a taxpayer, we're paying for all the lawyers that keep fighting the immigration. So while we're paying for both sides of the argument, it will never be won.
Karen, you're so right. It's utterly nuts, completely nuts, that taxpayers' cash is being used essentially to fund lawyers to sue the taxpayer, i.e. the government, because, of course, the government's money is our money. I mean, it's just beyond belief, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and I say this tongue-in-cheek. We should have let Boris build his airport in the middle of the Thames, and then we could have just took everybody there.
Well, Boris and his wonderful ideas. I think that was one of his madder ideas. It really is extraordinary, Karen. But anyway, thanks very much for your thoughts on that. That was Karen in Bournemouth with her concerns. Lots of messages coming in now. What about this one from Danny, who says, Richard, you read out tweets for rejoining the EU or praising your show. I've sent several tweets asking what you do about the Channel migrants. You ignored it. Danny, I'm sorry, I missed that. But my answer has always been, I've been very consistent on this. I think that we should be taking the migrants back to France and have a joint processing centre with the French that deals with them promptly, efficiently, identifies those who are genuine asylum seekers fleeing persecution from war zones, for example, and resettle those. But those who are economic migrants, of which I think that is a significant number, probably the vast majority, those should be returned from where they came from, Danny. The problem is that because the French refuse to entertain this, that's why the government has had to consider an alternative solution. I hope that helps, Danny. I'm sorry that I missed your earlier messages. I've always been very, very clear on that. Meanwhile, we've got other messages coming in here. We've got one who says, Julian Jessup never answered the question on the export of money. We sold the silver. Don't understand that. We're going to move on from that. Anyway, lots coming on. You know the number, 0344 499 1000. I've just got one here. I'm a pensioner, got an electric key meter. I'm disabled. My neighbour walks to the shop. I get a letter every year on how much I put in my meter. I've useless electric storage heaters. How much will it cost me this year? Hard to know. Surely it doesn't cost E.ON this much as other consumers. I think Christine there is concerned that essentially she's being asked to pay too much, even though she's only got an electric meter. Well, keep those calls, messages and tweets coming up. We'll try and get through them as quickly as we can. Coming up, we are going to be going to Aberdeen University, Tom Baxter, to talk about the decommissioning of oil rigs and what's the right thing to do. It's Tice Talk, it's Talk TV.
I'm Tom Newton-Dunn, and this is Talk TV. The most memorable moment in my career, without sounding completely conceited, it has to be interviewing President Trump in the Oval Office in the White House. Particularly, the little red button he had on his desk. I have no idea what he did as the interview went on. I wondered more and more, was he going to launch a nuclear strike on North Korea or open up a shark pit that I would then fall into? Turned out he pressed it right at the end of the interview, and in walked a butler with a tray carrying a Diet Coke. It was a Diet Coke button.
This is Talk TV News.
Good morning, I'm Nadira Tudor. Boris Johnson has asked Western leaders to steel themselves for a long war in Ukraine. Writing in the Sunday Times today, the Prime Minister called for additional weapons and funding, as well as more focus on getting food out of the country. This comes as Britain's top general has told every soldier to prepare to fight Russia in a potential World War III. The Sun reports new Army Commander General Sir Patrick Sanders wrote to the troops that there is now a burning imperative to forge an army capable of fighting alongside our allies and defeating Russia in battle. Former Chief of the General Staff, Lord Goddard, has told Times Radio deterring Russia with a strong army is vital, but the UK must increase its defence spending.
Frankly, to have an army of only 148 tanks and no tracked armoured fighting vehicles for the infantry to accompany them is madness. So Patrick is absolutely right that if we're going to take this seriously in the context of a long war that Boris Johnson is talking about, we've got to prepare.
Meanwhile, fierce fighting continues in the east. Ukraine says Russian forces are trying to push towards Kharkiv from the north, and the situation is difficult. They're aiming to shell the second largest city again. The city was badly damaged in the early stage of the war when it came under heavy bombardment. It's now been hit by missile strikes as recently as Friday. And in other news, the government's warning rail strikes will punish millions of innocent people. Transport Secretary says that will include some teenagers trying to take exams. However, rail union bosses say the government wouldn't negotiate. It's the biggest industry action since 1989, with more than 40,000 staff walking out on Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. People around the country are marking a Father's Day, including the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, who've released a picture of Prince William with his children in Jordan. The photo was taken in autumn last year. That's all for now. We'll have more in half an hour.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk TV. We're halfway through the show. It's all going on. There are tweets pouring in, some for, some against all of these issues in respect of unions, in respect of inflation. So we've got a great debate going on. And of course, you know, there's always a shortage of essentially sort of the resources available at government level, albeit it's our taxpayers' resources. And therefore you need to save some money. And I was fascinated the other day to read an article about the decommissioning of oil rigs. And you might think, hang on, where's he going with this one? But hear me out on this, because I think this is absolutely fascinating. When an oil rig, an oil well, comes to the end of its useful life, when the well is essentially sort of finished or pretty much done, then the normal plan is that the rig has to be taken down, the supporting structure has to be removed as well and taken back onshore for recycling. But of course that all costs a huge amount of money. And I'm delighted now to be joined by the retired senior lecturer at Aberdeen University, Tom Baxter, who's actually got a very different theory, which not only could save billions of pounds of taxpayers' cash, but also could actually, hear me out here, it could actually be even more sustainable and better from the environment. Tom, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. I really did enjoy your article on this. Just talk us through how leaving the redundant oil rigs in place, how would that help the ecosystems first of all, and then let's look at the money.
Well, these installations, they've been in place for many decades. And over that time, they've been colonised by barnacles, mussels. They're also shelters for predatory fish, and they're also shelters for small fish as well. So the actual structure itself is providing a marine ecosystem that's enhancing the marine environment. And this is well documented. There's many marine biologists have stated the actual benefits that these structures bring to a fairly barren North Sea.
It's absolutely fascinating. And you say there's other examples. I think you wrote in your piece, there's a programme in the US, the Rigs to Reef programme. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. It's slightly different from what I'm proposing in the sense that in the States, what they do is they relocate the oil and gas structure to generally shallower water. And there it provides, again, a structure for marine life to colonise. And it also becomes a favourite for recreational divers and recreational fishermen because of what it attracts. Remember, marine life doesn't have the same thought process as we do. What it is saying is a structure that it can use to its advantage. So if you think as a human you're leaving a mess down there, that's not how Mother Nature sees it.
Interesting, absolutely fascinating. So it's been essentially sort of used and experienced in the US. There's something like over 500 such rigs. Is that really right?
Yes, that's correct. The number, from memory, it's about 530 something. So it's custom and practice.
Okay, so there's good evidence to sort of rely on. And then what's the sort of the legal position in terms of the obligations on the operators to remove these rigs? What would sort of have to take place in order to change the process here in the UK?
Well, in the UK, we're mandated to remove almost everything. There's a few derogations, special cases, but generally you have to take everything out that you put in. And that's mandated by a grouping called OSPAR, the Oslo Paris Agreement. And it's a number in the teens of European countries that have signed up to remove offshore structures at the end of their life.
Right, OK, so that's the OSPAR. But what about sort of the laws in the UK? There's something about some 2017 laws.
Well, what you might be alluding to there is that the UK also has the Protection of Rare Species Act. Now, for example, a lot of these rigs have been colonised by cold water corals. And these cold water corals are very rare. But you can't make a case under OSPAR for leaving the installation in place because it has rare species on it.
So essentially the ecosystem sort of already created itself whilst it was an operating rig.
Yes, but you can take no credit for that within the current legislation for offshore. Whereas the UK's Protection of Species, which is a UK act, not an act authorised by many countries, says that you should protect endangered species if they have colonised a structure, perhaps like a pier. Yeah.
Interesting. And Tom, let's talk about the money, because obviously the oil companies, they have to essentially sort of provide billions of pounds to remove these rigs at the end of their useful life. So what sort of numbers are we talking about in terms of the potential saving to the taxpayer if the current rules were changed?
Well, the National Audit Office did a review a few years back, and the cost to the taxpayer then was £24 billion. So it's not an insignificant sum of money that the taxpayer or the public purse is assisting the oil companies for removal. What I would say, the oil companies are not doing anything underhand. This was all agreed beforehand, so that they're not trying to work a fast one here, if I could use that expression.
No, I get that they've obviously got to comply with the law, but the point is that actually, if the rules were changed, if they were allowed to leave them there, then the taxpayer would benefit by tens and tens of billions of pounds.
Well, yeah, maybe perhaps not tens and tens, but certainly around 10 billion or perhaps more. And of course the oil company is going to benefit as well. And if you think in the process of decommissioning, as the public purse has paid a lot of money for this, at the end of it, there's nothing to show for it. What we've done is dismantled something. We haven't invested in something that's going to have a legacy, like, I don't know, a factory or build a bridge for an island. This investment or this money from the public has no legacy. It's just it's dead money.
Fascinating, Tom. Is anybody actually lobbying the government hard to try and change this, even on a sort of trial basis?
Not to my knowledge. And although it would be in the oil company's interests, they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't lobby because I think they would be protective of their reputation in thinking that Joe Public is going to assume that this is dirty oil trying to wriggle out of its obligations.
Yeah, but I think we've got to be creative about this, and of course, if the sort of the lobbying was done in a different way to say that actually, if you remove them, then you're going to destroy these huge ecosystems, then people might appreciate that.
Well, that's exactly what we have to do. We have to educate the taxpayer as to what our obligations are here and what we're getting from it. Sorry?
It seems a double win to me, Tom. You get... you maintain an ecosystem and allow it to grow ever more, and you save the taxpayer billions and billions of pounds. Tom, I've got to go to a break, but I'm so grateful to you for coming on my show and talking about that. That was Tom Baxter, retired senior lecturer at Aberdeen University. Fascinating, I think. An opportunity to save billions of pounds for the taxpayer, and also, at the same time, that it's better for marine ecosystems. Absolutely fascinating. Interested on your thoughts on that. Various people saying we should just leave the structures and use them as offshore processing centres. But there's one message here that says that shows that oil drilling is beneficial for nature. I'm fascinated by that. Keep those thoughts coming in. We're going to be taking more calls, and we're going to be talking to John Leach. It's Tice Talk here on Talk TV. Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk TV. Lots of messages and questions coming in. I forgot to ask Tom Baxter how much it costs to maintain a decommissioned rig if you leave it out there. We're actually going to try and get him, just get an answer to that, because a couple of you have just messaged in. Meanwhile, another message here, lots of people listening, obviously, who've either worked in and around Aberdeen in the oil industry. One here says, my husband works for an oil company in Aberdeen. Projects are now starting to come in, although there's no longer the experienced people here to fill the job vacancies. IR35 killed off a lot of contractors for a start. And lots of oil companies, this is sad, lots of oil companies now won't take on student training because oil has been given such a bad name. That is not good news, not what we want to hear. Anyway, keep those messages and tweets coming in. Really, really fascinating. And there's just another one came in here. I actually cut this one off. So the idea that these rigs are beneficial for nature, which is great. Message here says, next step, instead of crushing and breaking down the dirty gas guzzlers, I think means cars, why not just drive them into sea so they become their own sort of ecosystems? Not sure about that, but anyway, who knows? Let's take a couple of calls. We're going to head up to Birmingham, where Arthur is on the line. Still good morning. Good morning, Arthur.
Good morning, Richard. I've rung up to talk to you about trade unions. I've had a checkered life with them, as far as I'm concerned. My mother always taught me, and my father, to be a trade union man, and I did this until I saw the Winter of Discontent, which I think sort of coloured my view on trade unions.
That was 78, 79, wasn't it?
Yeah, once they've got a form of power, they're like the little man on the British Legion door, where's your card? I had a bad experience with trade unions when I first went to British Leyland, where I worked, and over a course of 2 weeks there were 3 strikes. The 3 strikes were, first off, a trade union office door hadn't been put back on across the weekend after being repaired, and we lost time for it. The next one was, again, the supervisors on the line had red collars on their overalls. The inspectors had blue and the stores had brown. The inspectors were given the wrong coloured collar, and we've lost time over it. Then the final one was something to do with a chap who had been using a company vehicle tax disc, taking it out of his vehicle that he used, and putting it in his car. It was actually, I believe, but I can't be 100% certain on this, picked up by outside police forces. They then went out on strike for him. So, as you can see, I'm not a great believer in trade unions. My fear is that if you allow the ASLEF strike to continue, well, I'll call it the ASLEF strike, it's the RMT as well, you allow them to feel power again. And they will continue to stamp on things to make sure they get what they want.
Well,
that's my point, Richard.
No, it's fascinating, Arthur. Really, really interesting to hear some of those, frankly, what I'd consider utterly absurd examples of, time being lost over what, frankly, sound like pretty petty issues. And,
big time.
And therefore, eventually the businesses say, and the shareholders say, well, enough's enough. If you're going to behave like that, then we just can't operate. And it just, it goes completely wrong. You're so right. I mean, this is without question. This is the RMT flexing their muscles. I do wonder, do you think that they might overreach themselves and that this could be their equivalent of Arthur Scargill with the coal miners in the early 80s?
Well, again, there's another subject altogether for you, Mr. Scargill.
Well, exactly. But he basically, he overreached himself.
I do think that's possible. Yeah, do you know how they dealt with the issues surrounding the Leyland, the way things were going on? My nickname for it when my mum was there was Layoffland. And the way they dealt with it in the end was a guy called Michael Edwards.
Yes, I remember, yeah.
Yeah, well, Michael Edwards brought in what they called the blue paper. And you had to turn up for work on the Monday morning, or you didn't have a job.
Right. Well, that's how
they dealt with it.
I mean, that sounds pretty sensible. Arthur, thank you so much for those thoughts. Fascinating. As we face some of the challenges from that were experienced in the 1970s, anybody else who's got thoughts on the unions? I want the unions to be a proactive, positive force for their members, not a negative force that actually makes it harder to get productivity improvements. Surely we could agree on that. Let's go to North Wales, where David is on the line. Hi, David.
Oh, hello. Hi, Richard. How are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. Good, thanks. How are you? What's on your mind? What would you like to share with everyone?
Well, I want to look at the cost of living crisis. And it's easy to say the government will give bonuses or payments to counter the rising costs of gas and oil. But that is only part of the picture. I mean, everything is going up because of the price of gas and oil. And, I mean, as an example, a pound of butter has gone up £1 in the last month. And it's scheduled to go higher in the October. Now, we can't live, as people, ordinary people, we can't live with that sort of thing. And a couple of pounds here and there or a few £100 here and there, is not going to combat it and keep us warm. The only answer to it, in my view, is that the government must step in and force the companies to sell the oil and the gas at the price it was before they started hoisting it. That way, there's no inflation. People can live sensibly and eat and will be able to keep themselves warm.
No, David, you're so right that, of course, the price of energy, the cost of energy, affects not only individuals, us at home, families, but businesses, and therefore it drives up inflation across the board. You used quite right the example of butter and so many other things.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the problems, David, is that now, because of this government's flawed decade of energy policies, we're buying so much energy, gas and oil from overseas. We can't force those companies to reduce the price. So the only thing we can do, I believe, David, is...
We can, actually. We can come to an agreement, or the government can come to an agreement with the companies that they will reduce it down to a livable level for the people, but they will in some way compensate them.
But that means sending our money overseas, you see, David. What I would rather do is cut the tax on those goods, cut the taxes on fuel duty, cut all the taxes on our energy bills. That way the price goes down for the consumer, but we keep the money staying in the UK economy. That's my point.
Well, the thing is, I don't see why the government should be so keen to protect foreign huge companies as at the expense of our citizens.
You're quite right. There is far too much, in my view, on our critical national infrastructure. Far too much of the ownership is owned by companies overseas. I would renationalise 50% of all the utilities, so that when...
Wash your mouth out with soap, Richard.
No, hear me out, David. If you have a genuine joint partnership between the private sector and between the government for critical things like utilities, then when they have a good year under private sector management, then both sides benefit. The taxpayer benefits and the private sector benefits.
I agree with you. The really important things must be owned nationally.
There you are. You are. So you want good private sector management, David, but you want the taxpayer to share in some of the benefits.
Exactly.
Thank you, David. I've got to get one more caller in before we get to the top of the hour, David, but thank you so much for your thoughts there, his concerns about the cost of living, the cost of energy affecting the price of everything. We're in London with Stephen. Hi, Stephen.
Oh, hi, Richard. Just wanted to mention that I'm opposed to the rail strike 100%. Now, Keir Starmer seems to be almost in favour of it because he's criticising the Conservatives and sort of almost inferring that they wanted to go ahead to cause more havoc so they can sort of get back at them in some way. Well, my father used to work on the railway when it was National Rail. He died in 1970. He was a British Railway signalman, but he never went on strike at all. But I think this is so damaging now and so unpopular. And I think most of the workers wouldn't really want to go along with it. They've almost been brainwashed, I feel. But you're either for it or against it, aren't you, Richard?
Well, I think my concern is that this is a critical part of our country's infrastructure. Yes, many people are working from home, but, you've got school children. They can't get to schools to do their exams at this critical time. I just think there are so many reasons why the unions is adopting the wrong approach to the problem that everybody's got, which we understand, which is that, people are concerned about inflation and they're suffering real time. I just think there's a much better way of doing it. That's what I'm going on about.
Yes, I agree. I think they're shooting themselves in the foot. I think there'll be a backlash against the unions with this. And as you said earlier, I think it will be like in the 80s when Scargill was in the National Union of Miners leading them. It all went pear-shaped at the end there. And really, they need to reconsider, or maybe even the government put it down as an essential service, a railway.
Well, I think that's right.
Whereas they maybe not allowed to strike in some way. The police can't strike, the firemen can't strike, even though they did in the 70s.
Yes. Well, we need to look at it, maybe an independent mechanism. Stephen, stay with the show, because after the break, we are going to be talking to John Leach, who is the RMT Assistant General Secretary. So I'll be putting some of these thoughts and concerns to him on behalf of all of us, because I think the effects of this strike will be so damaging. They know that. Why are they doing it in this way to cause maximum disruption? I don't think it's right. I'm sure you don't too. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk TV.
TV, on radio and on your smartphone. This is Talk TV. Talk TV News at 12.
Good morning, I'm Nadira Tudor. Boris Johnson has asked Western leaders to steel themselves for a long war in Ukraine. Writing in the Sunday Times today, the Prime Minister called for additional weapons and funding, as well as more focus on getting food out of the country. This comes as Britain's top general has told every soldier to prepare to fight Russia in a potential World War III. The Sun reports new army commander, General Sir Patrick Sanders, wrote to the troops that there is now a burning imperative to forge an army capable of fighting alongside our allies and defeating Russia in battle. Former Chief of the General Staff, Lord Goddard, has told Times Radio deterring Russia with a strong army is vital, but the UK must increase its defence spending.
Frankly, to have an army of only 148 tanks and no tracked armoured fighting vehicles for the infantry to accompany them is madness. So Patrick is absolutely right that if we're going to take this seriously in the context of a long war that Boris Johnson is talking about, we've got to prepare.
Meanwhile, fierce fighting continues in the east. Ukraine says Russian forces are trying to push towards Kharkiv from the north, and the situation is difficult. They're aiming to shell the second largest city again. Kharkiv was badly damaged in the early stage of the war when it came under heavy bombardment, but has been hit by missile strikes as recently as Friday. And in other news, the government's warning rail strikes will punish millions of innocent people. However, rail union bosses say the government wouldn't negotiate. It's the biggest industry action since 1989, with more than 40,000 staff walking out on Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. The AA has called for road charges to be dropped, but travel editor Simon Calder says it's not a good idea.
I don't think you should effectively incentivise people to drive. I think that's going to make things even worse. It's a completely different world. Of course, we've got Zoom, we've got Teams, we've got online meetings, we've got hybrid working, so you won't have anything like the same level of devastation, unless you're a frontline worker in a hospital, in a school, and you haven't got a car and you've got to get to work.
People in France are heading to the polls today for the second round of the country's elections, just weeks after April's presidential vote. French President Emmanuel Macron is in danger of falling short of a parliamentary majority after the first round of voting saw his centrist camp tied with a left-wing coalition. People around the country are marking a Father's Day, including the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, who've released a picture of Prince William with his children in Jordan. The photo was taken in autumn last year. Those are the latest news headlines. Still to come, your Talk Sport update, but first, your weather.
Trust us to take you there. Times Travel sponsors Talk TV weather.
Most of the UK will remain dry this afternoon. However, there'll be some showers around, particularly across the north of Scotland and increasingly across the southwest of England. Moving into this evening and across the north of Scotland, we should see most of the showers begin to ease away, allowing some late sunshine to develop. Sunshine will also be in plentiful supply across southern Scotland, Northern Ireland and northern England, leading to a fine end to the weekend. Wales, the Midlands and East Anglia will also be dry as we start the evening, but further south it will be rather cloudy with some showers gradually spreading northwards. One or two heavier showers are possible, especially in the southwest. The Channel Islands, though, should be largely dry with some sunshine here too. The showers across the far south will then move a little further north, but most areas remaining dry.
Trust us to take you there. Times Travel sponsors Talk TV weather.
It's the final round of the US Open in Boston later today, and England's Matt Fitzpatrick takes a share of the lead as he chases his first major title. Meanwhile, Rory McIlroy sits 3 shots behind on 1 under.
Everything was solid today. Played really well. Hole puts at the right time, and yeah, it was just a great day. Wind was really strong, and it made it tough. You had to be switched on with where you were hitting it, where you were missing it, and I think that was why it was a great challenge, and really happy with my score.
Dame Kelly Holmes says she finally feels free after coming out. The double Olympic champion has said she's been living a secret life since she was 17. There's been an outpouring of love for the athlete, with sports star Ewan Thomas and Denise Lewis tweeting their support. And Freddie Burns says he's realised a childhood dream after kicking Leicester to their win over Saracens at Twickenham. His last-minute drop goal gave the team their 11th Premiership title. His teammates have celebrated the achievement.
We found a way, and yeah, I mean, we've got to deal with Freddie Burns' Instagram now for the next 3 months. There'll be a massive montage of that drop goal, 20 different versions, but I couldn't be prouder of Fred.
That's all for now. I'll be back with more in half an hour.
I'm Jeremy Carl, and this is Talk TV. What makes me really angry? Injustice, lies, and people not able to say what they feel without fear of being just cast aside, cancelled, whatever you want to say.
Welcome back to Tice Talk, and a very good afternoon. We are into the third and final hour of the show. It's been a busy show, tweets pouring in, as well as lots of calls. And of course, we're in 2022, but I have to say, it feels a bit like the 1970s. High inflation, we've got low growth, we've got strikes, and real concerns everywhere. And this, of course, is a huge week, because it is a week of strikes every other day, which essentially means pretty much it feels like the whole week is written off because of the train strikes. And some people say this is just the beginning of a summer of discontent. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by the Assistant General Secretary of the RMT Union, John Leach, to discuss where we're at, what may happen and why. John, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. So a big week ahead, essentially, for all of your members, but also for the impact it's going to have on the nation, because it's sort of nationwide, isn't it? John, can you just help me first, John? Why has the union gone straight to a week long of strikes, sort of every other day? We get the whole negotiating thing, rather than even almost like putting a marker down, like one day.
The union's strategy is to lay out the industrial action that we did, given the companies more than 2 weeks' notice, the government in actual fact, because that's really who's behind all of this. And we really had hope that they would come to the table with a meaningful offer. But what they've actually come to the table with is £2 billion worth of savings they need to make. No pay rise of any kind on the train operating companies, less than 7.5% cut below inflation for Network Rail, and nearly 3,000 job cuts. We can't quite believe it ourselves. We've kept Britain moving through the pandemic. We've been waiting...
As did many other industries. I mean, the supermarket workers are not striking, John. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. But, my job is to represent railway men and women in what we're doing. There's nearly just under 50,000 of us. It's just over that if you include the London Underground workers, who also are on strike over the defence of their jobs and their pensions and their conditions. And we thought we'd be able to get on with life this side of the pandemic, but quite the opposite. So we see it as a fight for the survival of our industry. We're being faced with proposals for fire and rehire. We're being told there's nearly 3,000 jobs to go in Network Rail. The staff pension fund in London Underground's on the table, being negotiated away by the Mayor of London.
But John, I get all that.
Yeah.
But what you're doing, essentially, for example, school children who can't get to school to do exams, they haven't been able to do exams for the last couple of years. I mean, or elderly people, who can't get and go about their daily lives. You're targeting people who essentially can do nothing about it, or most severely affected. What do you say to them? What do you say to the school children that can't take their exams, for example, because of your members' actions?
Yeah, well, we always regret the inconvenience this causes, and it's not hollow words. Our members are parents of school children as well. We have elderly parents. I have one as well. People are our members, are human beings. They've also are looking for a pay rise and some job security here, and not seeing their pensions, substantially attacked.
I'm glad
we get that, and I really think we're being painted, not by yourself, but by a lot of commentators, as the villains in the piece. We're not. The people who we represent, who are going on strike, don't want to be going on strike. They want to be coming to work. They want to be keeping Britain moving, which is what they do day in, day out. They are career professionals, and they are to be applauded for that. But they're also not going to stand by and allow their jobs and their wages and their conditions and their pensions, in some cases, to be just the price that has to be paid for this government's economic incompetence. And worse, this government will not rise to its responsibilities. They won't even meet.
John, I agree with you. This government is economically incompetent. There's no question. You touched on pensions. Can you just clarify, because obviously pensions is a big issue for everybody, indeed. Is it right that the defined benefits pension scheme, is that still open to new entrants?
Yes, it is. It's still
really
open. Yeah, in the train operating companies, and in London Underground, it still exists. Well, I mean, that's just but that's what people need, a reasonable and a decent pension.
But in the nicest possible way, John, the whole of the private sector had to get rid of defined benefit pension schemes. I mean,
we wouldn't accept that. We don't think pensions.
But that is one of the most beneficial, gold-plated, fantastic pension schemes ever, that has a huge value that no one seems to be talking about.
Well, we're talking about it, and so I'll tell you who else is talking about it in Transport for London is the Mayor of London and the government, and they have put it in jeopardy. And there was a review carried out as a result of one of the bailouts by the Mayor, and he's ruled nothing out.
Okay, so let's be clear, John.
You've got to make this point about pensions, because you're absolutely spot on to focus in on it. Everyone in society, whatever job they do, in the private sector, the gig economy, the public sector, is entitled to dignity in retirement. This is all we're talking about, and we're talking about keeping something that in some cases our members have paid into for maybe up to 40 years, 30 years.
No, I get that, but
they pay their fair share into it, just like everyone else. What this government's got is an ideological hatred of people having decent pensions. And we are not going to allow that to happen to our people.
The value of that pension scheme still being open is enormous. The reality is, though, everybody's feeling the pinch at the moment. You know, inflation is where it is. Yeah. But essentially what you're doing is making everybody else suffer in order that you can use your negotiating leverage. My point for you, and I said it to Eddie Dempsey the other day, John, I think you're in danger of overreaching yourselves, because in reality the world has moved on a bit. You've got more working from home, and what will happen is lots of people who are working, they did it during the pandemic, they'll work from home, so therefore you'll lose more customers, and therefore the operating companies will be looking for even greater cutbacks because of that reduction in fee income. So you need to be really careful you don't overreach yourselves and do a sort of a Scargill of the miners in the 80s.
Well, we're very careful and deliberate about what we're doing, but we have an absolute responsibility to the people who are in our union to defend their jobs and their pensions. We are not going to allow another P&O on the railways. We are not going to allow
John, I'm with you on P&O. I'm not aware that the operating companies are trying to do what P&O do, which I was with you, was absolutely appalling.
Well, let me just tell you what they have put on the table. They have put proposals on the table in discussions which haven't even resulted in a payoff or being made, of a form of fire and rehire for the entire railway train operating companies. They're talking about everyone going through a re-evaluation process, new contracts, more increased working hours. These aren't things I'm making up. I've been at the negotiations, and I'm telling your listeners and yourself and anyone else who wants to hear us, our union does not take striking lightly. Why would we? We care passionately about our industry and we look after our members. This kind of approach is the way in which we deliver the safe running of the railway every day, right across the UK.
John, why did you go straight to 3 days rather than sort of start at 1 day as a sort of a marker for 10, if you see what I mean, as opposed to go the full hog and the maximum disruption you could have caused?
We named those 3 days in an attempt to get the focus and the attention of the government. They won't even give us a meeting. It's an absolute disgrace. There's time in between always, you know, if negotiations started or had started for strikes potentially to be suspended, but it's not happening. But they're not interested in me. I cannot believe Grant Shapps won't even meet my General Secretary. It's a scandal.
Okay, hear me out here, though. Ultimately, you know, nothing stands still in life. Technology changes. We all have to adapt to new working practices. There's all sorts of chat that, you know, there's some sort of quite historic working practices that can't be changed. I mean, things like, is it right? There's a sort of story going around, John. Help me out on this.
Yeah.
Is it right there's a sort of a walking time allowance from the mess to the train, and that during that time the train driver can't even be spoken to by anybody, by a boss or something? Is that a myth or is that true?
You know, there are myths and rumours out there. I've heard that one over the years. What I know is my union has been around since 1872, and we have delivered and negotiated change from steam trains to diesel to electric to the most modern technology in signalling centres. We represent our members properly. We are professionals. We do it day in, day out, and we can deliver change. But what we cannot deliver is a fire and hire form of internal reapplication for your jobs, pensions being put on the scrap heap, thousands of jobs, and all of that in return for no pay rise.
That's what
this is about.
There's two things. At the beginning of my show, I actually said what the government should be doing, John, is that they should be increasing the income tax threshold before anybody pays any income tax from 12.5 grand to 20 grand, which would save everybody 30 quid a week, as a way of essentially sort of, you know, cutting taxes to help on the burden of inflation. For someone on average salary of about 31 grand, that's a 6% improvement in their net working take-home pay. For me, cutting taxes, that's a better way of dealing with this and a less inflationary way of dealing with this. But also, would your members, you know, would they entertain proper productivity bonuses, you know, based on improving punctuality and performance and efficiency targets? I mean, is that not a sort of middle ground that could be worked?
We negotiate around things like that all the time. We've got over 80,000 members right across entire transport industry, people on ships, people offshore, people on the tube. We do that kind of stuff. We negotiate, we do deals, we know how to bargain. But this isn't what you've just described isn't where we're at. Where we're at is £2 billion worth of cuts on the tube, £2 billion worth of cuts on the mainline railway, the staff pension fund up for grabs in the tube, on the railway 2,500 plus jobs on the scrap heap, a form of fire and rehire for staff on the train operating companies. It's a completely different picture, and that's why we've absolutely ran to the end of our tether.
Yeah,
remember, a lot of our members haven't had a single pay rise in 3 years.
Not many people in the country, John. But
yeah, but hang on, OK. But here's the thing, the train operating companies have made 500 million, not only the tops, sorry, the entire industry, let's get myself right there on my facts, have made £500 million a year profit out of this industry. That is a scandal.
Well, my concern not only is the inconvenience that everybody's going to cause, but I also think there's a real danger that you overreach yourselves, and that may ultimately work against you rather than for you. But, John, thank you so much for your thoughts. We understand where you're coming from. The pain and suffering on millions of people up and down the country, elderly, people going to work, school children, is going to be immense. That was John Leach, the RMT Assistant General Secretary there on behalf of his members. Stay with us. We've got lots more coming up for the rest of the show. You're listening to Tice Talk. It's Talk TV. Welcome back to Tice Talk this afternoon. We are well into the third hour. That was a pretty interesting interview with John Leach, the Assistant General Secretary of the RMT. Some of you are pretty cross with him, but some of you are pretty cross with me. There's a message here who says, Tim Rice, well, actually, my name's Richard Tice, but anyway, let's go to the rest of the message. Tim Rice is an awful interviewer. He seems to be supporting the RMT. Well, look, let's clarify what my name is. That's the first point. Secondly, I actually think I challenged him fairly robustly. But there we are. Maybe that wasn't robustly enough for you. I don't support what the unions are doing. I completely respect the right of unions to act on behalf of their members. But I don't think that they're going about it the right way. And if they came to the conclusion that they should go on strike action, he never answered me as to why he didn't start at 1 day rather than going straight to 3, deliberately making it every other day so that he maximised the trouble. But there we are. Meanwhile, this is absolute classic from Mac. Mac says, am I watching and listening to the 1970s radio, re the unions? What's on next? The Sweeney? The professionals? Yeah, I mean, it really does feel like that, I must say, as I started the show. Anyway, let's head up to the glorious county of Yorkshire and see what David reckons of all of this. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon, Richard.
What's on your mind?
Well, I'm a 77-year-old. I can remember the 50s, the 60s and 70s, and in those days I think the unions were necessary because there was some scrupulous employers in them days. But that was a long time ago. Things have changed, and I think now the railways ought to come under the same heading as the police and the hospitals.
They
were not allowed to. The police are not allowed to strike, and I think they ought to come under that. They get a good wage as it is. And what I would like to know, though, I can remember in the 60s and 70s there was what they called closed shops. You had to be a member of the union to work in the factory. If you didn't be a member, you couldn't work there.
Oh, that's right.
I still apply, does it? Do you know?
Well, I think implicitly, I think it does. For example, you don't see many job adverts, do you, to be a train driver? No, and there's a reason for that. I'm told it's basically friends and family.
Well, that used to be the same in the Ford Motor Company, in the docks, especially in the docks, dear Lord. You couldn't get a job in the docks unless you was a member, you was a son or somebody worked there. But I didn't realise that. I thought that was abolished, but I've never heard of closure. We don't hear unions
I suspect, David, it's officially abolished, but in reality, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that's what goes on behind the scenes. From what I understand.
I would have liked you to ask that fellow that was on there.
Yeah,
I noticed he didn't mention much about the question you put to him about the walking time they get.
He knew exactly the answer to that. I believe that is true. They got this walking time allowance.
He's not going to tell us everything.
No, but also the fact that the pension scheme, a defined benefit scheme, is still open to new entrants, I find utterly extraordinary. Yeah. Most people around the country, because those basically bankrupt businesses, they bankrupt the country. It's completely unaffordable.
Yeah. You're quite right. And also, you said if you overstep the mark, I think they're going to do themselves more harm than good.
I think so.
I'm sure they are. There's not 70s and 60s and 70s now.
David, thank you so much for your thoughts there. Well, we had that guy who didn't like the way I interviewed it, whereas Bumble says superb interview by Richard, who nailed it. There we are. Let me know your thoughts, your views. We're going to head from Yorkshire down to the glorious town of Maidstone, where Rosemary's on the line. Hi, Rosemary.
Hello, Richard. I'm with you, and I'm too much of an individualist to join a union.
Well, that's an interesting thought, yeah. You know, I mean, essentially you would negotiate on your own. Look, we get the point why unions exist, and as David just then said, you know, in years gone by, decades gone by, you know, there was some very bad mistreatment of workers. So you understand why unions emerge, but do you think they're overreaching themselves, Rosemary?
Definitely. You see, I go back, well, I'm pretty ancient. I can very well remember the 70s when we had power cuts and goodness knows like that. So, I mean, I've been there, done that, seen it. and I was a wartime child. You know, I lived through the war, so saw blackouts and goodness knows what, and shortages of everything. So, been there, done all that, and I think it's appalling what they're doing. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so you think they're going to overreach themselves?
Hopefully.
Yes, and so, in a sense, for the population, we're going to suffer short-term pain, but there'll be medium-term gain if they overreach themselves.
Just at the wrong time, too. We need everybody pulling their weight these days, but nobody seems to be.
No, it's really not good. And, of course, you know, if they get anything like their way, then it just opens the door for all of the other unions.
Oh, that's right. Actually, what I was really ringing up about was about the immigrations, and I wanted to know whether immigrants are sent to Scotland and Wales or Northern Ireland. Or is it just England, again, that's got them all...
A very good question, to which, honestly, I don't know, Rosemary, but I'm told they're running out of hotels that they've been block booking to fill them up.
Well, I'll tell you where they could all go. Mind you, they probably won't like it. I've been very, very lucky in that I've done some of the river cruises, and we went up the River Oder, which has got Poland one side, East Germany the other, and we had to go from East Germany by coach, from the Polish border, really, through to Hamburg to get a flight. It's empty.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it's not part of the UK, Rosemary, but anyway...
no, Germany. Oh, no.
No, Germany's not part of the UK. Rosemary, I've got to take one more call before we go to the bottom of the hour. Gordon is in Northampton. Hi, Gordon.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, just quickly, what's on your mind?
I would just like to know when you're actually going to run for the government, because the people we have at the minute are just doing no good.
They're not doing a great job, that is for sure. Well, we've got candidates at all the by-elections, Gordon, and at the next general election we will have about 600 candidates to stand around. So, you know, we're going to stand and give people a democratic choice.
Well, I hope so, Richard, because you'll have my vote.
Well, there you are. Thank you, Gordon. I really do appreciate that. You know, democracy's best when there's more choice, more debate, more discussion. Gordon, thank you very much for that. Lots of messages coming in, lots of tweets, lots of concerns. I think the overriding feeling is that people feel that, yes, unions, of course, should do a good job for the members, but the RMT are overdoing it. They're overreaching themselves. They're essentially over-negotiating, and it may come back to bite them where it hurts. Anyway, I'm interested in your thoughts, your views. Stay with us. We've got Henry Bolton after the break. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk TV.
I'm Tom Newton-Dunn, and this is Talk TV. The most memorable moment in my career, without sounding completely conceited, it has to be interviewing President Trump in the Oval Office in the White House. Particularly, the little red button he had on his desk. I had no idea what it did as the interview went on. I wondered more rumors as he'll launch a nuclear strike on North Korea or open up a shark pit that I'd then fall into. Turned out he pressed it right at the end of the interview, and in walked a butler with a tray carrying a Diet Coke. It was a Diet Coke button.
This is Talk TV News.
Good afternoon, I'm Nadira Tudor. Boris Johnson has asked Western leaders to steel themselves for a long war in Ukraine. Writing in the Sunday Times today, the Prime Minister called for additional weapons and funding, as well as more focus on getting food out of the country. This comes as Britain's top general has told every soldier to prepare to fight Russia in a potential World War III. The Sun reports new Army Commander General Sir Patrick Sanders wrote to the troops that there's now a burning imperative to forge an army capable of fighting alongside our allies and defending Russia in battle. Former Chief of the General Staff, Lord Dannett, has told Times Radio deterring Russia with a strong army is vital, but the UK must increase its defence spending.
Frankly, to have an army of only 148 tanks and no tracked armoured fighting vehicles for the infantry to accompany them is madness. So Patrick is absolutely right that if we're going to take this seriously in the context of a long war that Boris Johnson is talking about, we've got to prepare.
Meanwhile, fierce fighting continues in the east. Ukraine says Russian forces are trying to push towards Kharkiv from the north, and the situation is difficult. They're aiming to shell the second largest city again. Kharkiv was badly damaged in the early stage of the war when it came under heavy bombardment, but has been hit by missile strikes as recently as Friday. Police in Brazil say British journalist Dom Phillips was shot with hunting ammunition. His remains have been recovered more than 2 weeks after he went missing in the Amazon, along with indigenous expert Bruno Pereira. 3 people have been arrested in connection with the murders. Dame Kelly Holmes says she finally feels free after coming out. The double Olympic champion has said she's been living a secret life since she was 17. There's been an outpouring of love for the athlete, with sports stars Ewan Thomas and Denise Lewis tweeting their support. That's all for now. We'll have more in half an hour.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk TV. I can't believe it, time has flown. We're into the last half an hour of the show. Lots of calls, lots of messages, lots of tweets, lots going on. I did just refer to a couple of by-elections going on, and of course there are lots of candidates standing for those by-elections. You can get a full list of those various places online, including on the BBC website, in order to see who is standing in those by-elections. As I say, lots of different candidates. Meanwhile, we've been focusing domestically, but we haven't gone internationally. But there is, of course, sadly, the ongoing war in Ukraine. And big article in the Sunday Times this morning about Boris Johnson saying we've got to prepare for the long haul. I've been saying that for a while. And I'm delighted now to be joined by Henry Bolton, who is former leader of the European Union's Crisis Response and Operational Planning Team in Ukraine, Henry Bolton, OBE, to discuss this further. Good afternoon, Henry. How are you doing?
Hi, Richard. I'm well, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So, Boris saying we've got to prepare for the long haul, and in a sense, many days now, Ukraine is sort of slipping further and further back in the newspapers, as, heaven forbid, it becomes sort of the sad and tragic normal. Of course, this long haul, what sort of long haul do you think we might have to be looking at here?
I think, realistically, we're looking 3 to 5 years. I'm leaving aside the possibility of some sort of change in Moscow. If we assume that the political situation in Moscow remains as is, then I think we're talking, 4 or 5 years wouldn't be unrealistic. And I'll tell you why, Richard. Some time ago, a few weeks ago, everybody was saying, when the Russians sort of moved back from Kiev, that they had failed to achieve their strategic objectives. I've never agreed with that idea. Back in January, about 5 weeks before the invasion started, I laid out what I saw as Russia's strategic objectives, militarily and politically. And I said that they would not go to Kiev. In World War II, the Russians took Kiev, or the Soviets took Kiev from the Germans, but they lost 100,000 killed in action in that one operation. And the Russian army simply can't afford that sort of level of casualties against a defended city of that size. They were never going to go there. The purpose of that feint towards Kiev was to draw Ukrainian forces to screen and defend Kiev, and thereby divert them away from the Russian main effort, which was developing consolidating the land corridor from Crimea to the Russian Federation, and doing what Putin has said all along that he wanted to do, which was secure the whole of the oblasts, the counties, if you like, of Luhansk and Donetsk, which is what they're fighting over at the moment. And the Russians are, very gradually, and at huge cost, they are making ground in that respect. Now, what will happen is that the Ukrainians will continue the fight. Even if Russia consolidates those areas, then the Ukrainians will still be attacking the Russian forces. And in that sense, we're going to end up, and almost have done at the moment, with some sort of stalemate, a fairly stable front line, if you like, which is going to continue all the way through until one side manages to inflict enough attrition on the other for it to effectively say, OK, we've had enough and go. And so we are in the long haul.
Yeah, so essentially, Henry, at the moment, we're obviously supplying considerable quantities of military hardware, along with other countries, and that cost is going to go up and up. Do we get to a point, if it is the long haul, given the pressures on our own budgets, do we get to a point where the public may start to question the cost of that provision? And in a sense, do you think that may happen? And if so, at what level?
I think so, Richard. And I think, as you said just now, Ukraine is sort of fading from the headlines. And I understand that. The longer this goes on, the less newsworthy it is. But General Saunders, the head of the UK Land Army, recently appointed, a man I know and worked very closely with when I was in Helmand, and a very, very good choice for that position, has said now that we're in, like the Prime Minister has, and in fact the NATO Secretary-General, that we're in this for the long haul. But he's also said that we must prepare, if necessary, for a land war in Europe, and the British Army has to be ready for that. He's not talking about fighting in Ukraine. He's talking here about the belief that I share with him that if Russia is able to consolidate its position in Ukraine, there will be another step, and that will be towards the Baltic states, in which case we will be committed to fight. Now, if we do not manage to support the Ukrainians long term to keep the pressure on Russia and ultimately defeat it militarily, then that next step is always a possibility. And so in that regard, we've got to keep it in the headlines, and we've got to keep the public opinion aware that it is not only about Ukraine. This is not, and I've kept saying this, people must understand this is not another war over there somewhere. This is not a war in Afghanistan or Iraq.
No, indeed.
This is a war in Europe.
And also, of course, it's actually impacting everybody day to day because of the impact on energy prices, food bills, and possibly even actually ultimately food shortages in certain parts of the world. So there is a direct financial impact on everybody, and the longer it goes on, the more embedded that impact becomes, and the more, in a sense, the government's wrong thinking that this is just a temporary spike in energy prices.
I agree. I agree entirely. The energy problem is not going to go away until the Ukraine war goes away. But the other thing, Richard, that's keeping this war going, frankly, is the European Union's approach. Now, you know, the Germans and the French, the Germans particularly, are still effectively funding this war for Russia because of the gas and the oil that they're procuring from the Russian Federation. Now, that's got to stop. But my fear is, I mean, recently we had the leaders of Germany, France and Italy travel to Kiev. And now we've got the European Union saying that they're opening up candidate status to Ukraine for the European Union.
So, Henry, given your and my view on the European Union and Brexit, what benefit do you think Ukraine get by joining the EU?
Well, this is the thing, Richard. They're not going to certainly they're not going to join the EU anytime soon. But what this does, and this is leverage for the EU. We should not discount the recent past, where President Macron and to a certain extent President Scholz of Germany, Chancellor Scholz of Germany, have both said to the Ukrainians that they should be prepared to cede land to the Russians, basically accept Russian occupation, because they don't want this war to go on any longer, because they're dependent on this gas. So they're trying to give away Ukrainian territory. Now, the problem is with this offer of candidate status, it's a carrot that the European Union is offering Kiev, and I suspect we're going to see that the French offer particularly, or suggestion that Ukraine should give up land now, come forward even more. Ukraine now is in a very difficult position. The European Union is going to say, on the one hand, listen, end this war, accept partial defeat, and come closer to the EU, or we will veto further support to you. We won't provide you any support. That's what they did with the Minsk agreement. The Germans did that.
So essentially you think that the EU is going to sort of try and lever and strong-arm Ukraine into ending the war early and ceding some of their own land in order to get the supposed benefits of EU membership. Henry, thank you so much for that. Fascinating thoughts there from Henry Bolton, former leader of the European Union's crisis response and operational team in Ukraine. Stay with us. We're taking your calls, your views. Before at 1 o'clock, it is, of course, Trisha Goddard. You're listening to Tice Talk here on Talk TV. Welcome back. You're listening to Tice Talk for the last quarter of an hour of the show before Trisha Goddard takes us through from 1 till 4. And then, of course, it's Kevin O'Sullivan with his fantastic show. And then it's Mark Saggers. Lots of messages still coming in. Interesting tweet here from RoboGoat, or Rob, I think it is. Richard, it's all very well that we provide support and military hardware to Ukraine to help them fight Russia. But if we keep on doing so, will we have enough for ourselves if we need to defend our own country at some point? Interesting question. Firstly, let's hope we never do have to. But let's also hope that our military planners and people doing the logistics and the procurement need to ensure that we have got enough. Thanks for that, Rob. So let's go to Coventry, where I think I've got David on the line. Good afternoon, David.
Hello, Richard. Many years ago, in the early 70s, I joined the fire brigade, and I went to a station in the middle of London, and I was quite a fairly militant watch, and we sent a circular around the brigade. And a few days later, these two union wallers turned up late one evening on a night shift and sat us all down in the lecture room, and basically said to us, you have sent a missive round the rest of the 214 other stations. That's not allowed under union rules. If you do it again, we'll take your union cards away. And because it was the wonderful closed shop, you know what that'll mean.
You lose your job.
That was the threat made to us by union wallers who think that it's okay for them to threaten the livelihoods of 16 men.
Wow.
It was appalling.
Wow.
So that's the close shop for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's right.
Are we going back to that? That's what Corbyn and his mates want.
Is this... I mean, David, you got good experience of this. You know, you saw it in the 70s. Does this feel approaching as bad as then? You know, how concerned are you the direction of travel here?
I'm concerned that some of the unions are going back to the Arthur Scargill sort of mentality. Well, you've always had that mentality, but they haven't had the power. They're starting to flex their muscles and push, and it is purely political. I was in the Fire Brigade Union for many years, and the hierarchy of the Fire Brigade Union, you didn't stand a chance of getting into that hierarchy unless you were a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, the Workers' Revolutionary Party, or some other right-wing, broad-minded organisation.
You mean left-wing?
That's exactly what I say. That's tongue-in-cheek, yes. Yeah, very much tongue-in-cheek.
Absolutely.
And the country doesn't need that. I've heard people say, even members of my family, we should ban unions. I fundamentally disagree with that.
Yeah, I disagree with that as well. Sometimes I think people have got me wrong on that. I'm with you.
When my father-in-law came back from the war, he was working for a concrete company not a million miles away, which is still in being. And because he was of East German Polish extraction, when he finished whatever job he'd been given, he would find himself something else to do. One day, he got into a cement mixer and started cleaning it, and some muppet turned it on with him inside. One of these big
oh my God,
lorries you see driving down the road. And he screamed, obviously. Fortunately, it didn't kill him, but one of his legs was smashed almost beyond recognition. And he was taken off to hospital. And a few days later, one of the bosses from the company came to the hospital bed and got him to sign a document. He said, "Here, Bill, sign there." And so Bill, being an ex-soldier and always did as he was told by the hierarchy, he signed. And that exonerated the company of all responsibility.
And there's no question, you know, I think that there were many examples where there was some abusive management teams and companies that you know, looked after their staff and workers really badly, and that was why unions became so strong. But I guess it's overreaching the other way that then, in a sense, they work against themselves.
Yes, what we need is a sensible approach, and I could tell you I bore you to death with stories about union representatives who were sensible. and who did their job really well, really responsibly, and did a
David, just help me on this thing, because I talked about it in the first hour of the show. I don't know if you were listening, about there's 24,000 union reps who are essentially paid for by the taxpayer in order to carry out their union facility time for their union work. And that's been since the 70s, but it's only recently come to light how much that's grown.
I heard that portion, and I couldn't believe it. I was really, really surprised. I know that in the fire service, union reps were able to take time off for union business, or take time away from their official duties. I wasn't aware it was full-time paid by the taxpayer agreement, so that is news to me.
Yeah, well, there we are. That's what the Taxpayers Alliance have revealed, and it adds up to 100 million quid. Dave, thank you so much indeed. That's David in Coventry with his experience there of the unions. And we're going to head up to Stratford-upon-Avon, where we've got Martin Gower, who's former NHS Trust chairman and frequent guest on Talk TV. Martin, good afternoon. How are you doing?
Good afternoon, Richard. Very well. Thanks for having me on. Good show, by the way.
Thank you. What's on your mind, Martin?
I wasn't going to talk about the NHS today. Most of my career was actually in the newspaper industry, ending up the last 10 or 15 years as managing directors of some quite big businesses. So I had a bit of union experience with the print unions, and they were about as wacky as you can get. But I really wanted to talk to you quickly about your proposals for the tax threshold. I heartily agree with it. I think this would have been a far better route than having all the things of handouts here, a bit of rebate on your council tax there, a bit of this and a bit of that. I think also that people who are paid maybe 13,000, 14,000 paying tax, probably paying tax with one hand and having benefits in the other hand, is just a nonsense that we need to really get over. So I think there is, though, one thing that I would suggest. This may sound slightly strange, but how about a temporary increase on VAT for luxury goods? In other words, things that people don't really need. It doesn't mean they can't buy them. They might have to pay a little bit more for them. Or if they were buying, for example, a very expensive motor car, they might have to compromise a little bit on the spec in order to get it within their budget. But I think there is a way of funding by indirect tax. And don't forget the non-DOMs and the very high earners from other countries pay VAT here. So that would all help.
But I understand where you're going with it, but are the numbers involved? Is it worth the candle? Would be my question.
I don't know the numbers, but I do think it would go down quite well, in the sense that there's always the people on the left, or even on the sort of soft right, who say, oh, well, the top ones don't pay
politically, Martin, you think it might be quite smart. I get that. Very interesting. Martin, I'm just going to try and squeeze in one more call before the top of the hour. Thank you so much for calling. That was Martin Gower from Stratford-upon-Avon. We're going to head up to York, the glorious York, where Mike is there. Hi, Mike.
Afternoon, Richard. How are you?
I'm good. We've just got a minute. What's on your mind?
OK, it is out to wipe off £1,000 off everybody's rent. How many estate agents who sell houses charge 10% to sell your house? There's none. So why...
do you mean, sorry, Mike, do you mean 10% to rent your house, I think?
No, 10%. When you're selling your house and you're selling a house...
They normally charge sort of 1 to 2%?
Correct. So why are letting agencies allowed to charge 10%, which is passed on to the renter, the tenant?
No, it's a good question. I guess it's a question of the absolute quantum of the fee, isn't it?
No, absolutely not. They do nothing for it. The person who owns the property actually has to pay these days, which is a scandal in itself, the £600 finder's fee. So the estate agent is really... The rents I charge are roughly $10,000 a year.
It's a good point, Mike. And also, it's surprising that it's almost like there's a cartel. I don't think there is, but...
No, there is.
But everybody charges the same, don't they?
They do. So why?
Yeah,
I could give me a day with an housing minister, and I could wipe off £1,500 off everybody's rent.
I mean, there is obviously a job of work to be done, but I think what you're saying, Mike, is that you're surprised that cost hasn't reduced with market forces.
Yeah, well, honestly, give me a day with him.
Give you a day. All right, Mike. I've got to go, Mike, but I get the point. We get the point. You think it's too high, too expensive to rent your homes. Thank you from Mike in York. And we are now nearly done. But waiting patiently and happily is Trisha. Good afternoon, Trisha. How are you?
I'm just getting over COVID, but otherwise okay. Happy Father's Day. Happy Father's Day.
Oh, bless you. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's been pretty busy. It's been full on. The switchboard has been absolutely manic. People went, they got pretty excited after my Sunday sermon. What's coming up on your show, Trisha?
We have our faith panel, as usual, looking at headlines through the eyes of religious leaders. We're going to look at the legitimacy of massive crippling strikes, and also the bishops, all of the bishops getting together to condemn Rwanda. So we want to have a look at the eyes, those stories through the eyes of religious leaders. Also, we have our doctor in the house. We look at the medical stories breaking this week, and we look at our mental health stories as well. And because it's Father's Day, we're going to be visiting some men's health organisation, one called Sheds. I don't know if you've got a garden shed, but they're meant to be
I haven't now, but I used to have one. We bought a new one and it blew away last winter, but anyway.
Oh, no, I'm so sorry about
Nightmare.
that. Well,
Garden Sheds, you've got a full-on show then,
lots
Trisha.
Coming up on the
lots
show.
coming up.
Absolutely.
That's Trisha Goddard for the next 3 hours. Stay with her. That will be absolutely brilliant. As always, my production team have also